To say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christys, on GB News and GB News Radio.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
delicious?
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train.
Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa!
Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Right, we are about 4 minutes away from PMQs. We're going to be taking that live.
Yeah, and afterwards, Mark Longhurst and Pip Thompson will sit down with Labour MP Steve McCabe and Conservative MP Bob Seeley for some in-depth analysis on PMQs.
Right, let's talk to Emma and Stephen now about what might come up at PMQs today. Immigration, very high up on the agenda, Stephen. Now, Robert Jenrick's been going around today to say they're going to close 100 hotels looking after, or housing migrants, looking after extremely well in some situations. This is something that Conservatives have got to get right before the next election.
Well, yes, I mean, at the moment, they're making a big song and dance about moving sort of a couple of dozen people in there, and it's going to be difficult for Sunak. I mean, Sunaked, they call him nowadays, because he's looking quite exhausted from all this. But there's two personal things. One is yesterday morning, the memorial shield for David Amis, who was murdered, as we know, was revealed on the wall and quite close to the one where Joe Cox is. In fact, as you come into the House of Commons chamber, all round you are the shields of MPs who were killed in the war, and also people like Erin Eve who were killed while serving MPs. And sometimes you forget that MPs actually have quite a dangerous job.
Yeah.
So the other thing, of course, is the Peter Bone thing. Peter Bone had a reputation in Qs for years and years ago. Said, as Mrs. Bone said to me at breakfast this morning. Well, now we know that what Mrs. Bone said to me at breakfast was on your bike, Peter. But so there will be some mention of that and the possibility of another by-election. But you're absolutely right. It will be. Obviously, Israel-Palestine, the Hamas situation this morning with the attack on the sea, but it will also be about immigration. It'll be about... I think they'll try to get something in it about inflation with us. It's not quite as bad as it was.
Sorry, I was going to say, and maybe bankers' bonuses, Emma, in terms of the fact that the bankers' bonus cap has now been dropped so bankers can make a fortune. There is some political capital to be made out of that from Labour today.
Yeah, I mean, it's not difficult to imagine how Labour are going to respond to this. But it's one of those subjects that just lends itself very well to political posturing, doesn't it?
And it'd be good if we could see some policy from Labour on how they would attempt to deal with the illegal immigration crisis. But today's news, of course, Labour Party data has shown it's £800 a night for a berth on the Bibby Stockholm. Do you think we can expect Labour to put the boot into the Tories on that?
I do wonder whether Starmer facing the backlash, however small or large it may be in reality, the fact that it's in the press and being described as a meltdown is surely enough smoke and mirrors for it to be considered in PR terms. I wonder whether Starmer will moderate himself somewhat on the migration issue in order to appease certain voting demographics who are annoyed with him over his stance on Israel and Hamas, or whether he'll lean into it and actually be quite, well, at least I don't think that they would be robust in reality, but I think maybe he might talk tough in order to lean into it. So it'd be interesting to see which way he chooses to go.
The Tories will certainly be going on the 20 or so Labour councillors who've resigned. They'll certainly be pressing on that. And I should imagine they'll also be having a go at the SNP as well, who were sort of co-signatories of this 36-name early day motion that was being submitted. So there's going to be a lot of this sort of personality stuff. But, I mean, one of the problems is you never know what's going to be asked. I mean, Gerald Kaufman said to me when I first got elected, there's only one question that you can ask Tony Blair at Prime Minister's Questions. And I said, what's that? He said, would the Prime Minister care to remind us of his latest triumphs? And I actually did ask him that once.
But that is because Tony Blair was very, very good at self-marketing and promotion of himself. Rishi Sunak doesn't have that same skill. Neither does Starmer.
Keir Starmer even less so.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, there was that lovely time we were having a big debate about the European Union, and Tony Blair said, listen, Norway's not in the European Union. Well, nobody had said it was, but because there was such a hubbub, everybody thought somebody on the Tory bench had said Norway's in the EU.
Well, that's because he was an actor, Tony Blair.
No,
Fundamentally, first and foremost.
Very quick. His brain was almost as quick as Emma's. I mean, he's very, very sharp.
But it's interesting because Starmer is positioning himself as, Blair to...
Well, Blair was the heir to Thatcher, wasn't he? The people used to say he was the heir to Maggie.
but I wonder if the Labour Party, all they're doing now is attacking the Tories on illegal immigration, but they're not having any ideas of their own. But do they need to do that? I mean, what's the way that the Tories can try and turn this around at the moment, Emma? It seems like the Tories are heading over the edge of a cliff.
I don't know if they can turn it back, if I'm honest. They'd have to really get their act together very, very fast in order to turn the ship enough to miss the iceberg that's coming. I think that Keir Starmer could do one of two things. I mean, either he can talk tough, but I don't think that they've actually got any real tangible policies that would convince, the voters.
Energy security and the idea, the tribute. This,
on migration, I was going to say.
I know, but you're talking about policies. I keep thinking it's sort of GBNews. In fact, it's GB Energy, this company that we're talking about setting up. Because the cost of living, you remember, it's the famous, James Carver, it's the economy, stupid. Immigration is not the #1 item on most people's agenda. It is the cost of living, the fact that we can't afford to heat and eat. That is the big issue, and that's where Labour is making the case.
My point was going to be that I think, given the bad PR handling of this mosque stunt that he pulled, it seems that from Starmer's perspective, the best thing he can do in order to win votes at the next general election is to just keep his head down while the Tories keep mucking things up or fail to turn the ship, as I said. Because every time he does try to wade in, he seems to do it in a way that is somewhat candid, and it tends to backfire.
That's a counsel of despair, that is, isn't it, really?
Yes.
Whose side are you on?
OK, let's go live. Here is the Prime Minister.
The friends and families of those who lost their lives. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I join the Prime Minister in expressing my sympathies to all those affected by the recent storms. But, Mr. Speaker, 2 million people just cannot be sustained from 20-odd aid lorries. Utter catastrophe is being unleashed in Gaza. Doesn't the Prime Minister now see that only a humanitarian ceasefire can bring about the scale of emergency aid that is needed? Of course, Israel has a right to defend itself in line with international and humanitarian laws. But we must also speak out when those laws are breached. So surely he agrees that depriving 2 million civilians, 1 million children of food, of water, medicines and fuel is not in accordance with international law. Will he press Israel to restore the supply of these essentials for the sake of innocent civilians and the future of the entire region?
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's important that we do everything we can to get humanitarian aid to those who need it in Gaza, which is why on Monday we announced a doubling of our international aid to the region, and why the Development Minister is actively engaged with our partners on the ground to ensure that that aid gets to those people as quickly as possible.
Albert Course. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Double child rapist and murderer Colin Pitchfork had yet another parole review hearing only a few weeks ago. I thank the Justice Secretary for having listened to me and engaged the reconsideration mechanism rule. Now, I know the Prime Minister doesn't have any decision-making role within the Independent Parole Board. It's independent of government, but it is a wing of the executive. It is not the judiciary. Now, does the Prime Minister agree with me that men who rape and brutally murder young women, as Mr Pitchfork did to Dawn Ashworth and Linda Mann in my constituency, does he agree that generally, as a point of principle, these sexual offenders should remain in prison for most of their natural lives?
I agree with my honourable friend that the public should be confident that murderers and rapists will be kept behind bars for as long as is necessary to keep the public safe. And that's why we're reforming the parole system. Our Victims Bill will mean that minimising risk and protecting the public are the sole considerations in parole board decisions. It will also give the Justice Secretary the power to step in on behalf of the public and take a second look at decisions to release the most serious offenders, including murderers and rapists. And last week we announced that we will be introducing longer sentences for dangerous criminals. For the most heinous crimes, life will mean life.
Yeah. We come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Can I join the Prime Minister in his comments about all those affected by these storms? Can I start by welcoming the new member for Mid-Bedfordshire? The first Labour MP ever to represent those beautiful towns and villages. He defied the odds, history, and of course the fantasy Lib Dem bar charts. Can I also welcome the new member for Tamworth? She will be a powerful representative for her constituents. Is the Prime Minister as relieved as I am that those constituents are not burdened with his defeated candidate who told them, don't worry, Mr Speaker, I'm going to sanitise this, to F off if they're struggling with the cost of living?
Well, Mr Speaker, I'm proud of what this government is doing to support the most vulnerable over the past year. But, Mr Speaker, can I in fact join him in welcoming the new members to their places? After all, I suspect the new member for Mid-Beds may actually support me a little bit more than the last one. Although I did notice that the new member said that they will be opposing new housing in their local area, while the new member for Tamworth claimed that they will protect green spaces. I would urge them to have a word with their leader, because that's not exactly his position, Mr Speaker. Although, with his track record of U-turns, who knows what his housing policy will be next week?
Well, so much for being the change candidate. He can't even distance himself from those appalling comments. But I do have to ask him, where on earth does the Prime Minister think his candidate got the idea in the first place that throwing expletives at struggling families was his government's official position?
Prime Minister! Well, Mr Speaker, let's just look at the record of what this government is doing to help those people. Paying for around half of a typical family's energy bill over the last year, support worth over £1,500. For the most vulnerable in our society, receiving £900 in direct cost of living support, record increases in the national living wage, record increases in welfare, and this winter, Mr Speaker, pensioners to receive an extra £200 or £300 alongside their winter fuel payment to help them through what we know is a tough time. All of that, Mr Speaker, significant support funded by this government, all of that would be put at risk by Labour's reckless plans to borrow £28 billion a year.
He keeps boasting about how great things are. The voters keep telling him he's got it wrong. But I can see why the Tamworth candidate thought he was just following government lines. Annalisa and her 2 children lived in their home for 8 years. In May, they were kicked out with a no-fault eviction notice. Despite his government's pledge to scrap no-fault evictions, this week the Prime Minister crumbled to the landlords on his own backbenches and killed the policy. What message, other than the message delivered by his candidate in Tamworth, could Annalisa possibly take from that?
Prime Minister Speaker, we've taken significant action to help renters like Annalise and others. We've capped holding deposits at 1 week. We've protected tenants from rip-off tenancy fees, delivered almost 500,000 affordable homes for rent, and halved the number of percentage of substandard homes in the private rented sector, and strengthened local authority enforcement powers, because this government is delivering for renters. But we are also, Mr. Speaker, trying to ensure the new generation can buy their own home. So perhaps he can explain to Annalisa and thousands and millions of others why, when we brought forward plans to unlock 100,000 new homes, he stood in the way of that.
Just to say, it's Prime Minister's questions, not opposition questions. Keir Starmer. Sorry, Prime Minister, it is Prime Minister's questions. I don't need you nodding against my decision. Yes.
Well, I'm sure Annalisa and her children, who've now been evicted, will take great comfort from that non-answer. Emma and her teenage son saw their mortgage go up by more than a quarter. They may think this is funny. This is real life. After 16 years of dutifully paying their mortgage, for the first time, she's having to choose between new shoes for her son and putting the heating on. All because his party crashed the economy, pushing mortgage rates to their highest levels in decades. He says ignore all that. Ignore the fact that the guilty men and women responsible are standing again as his candidates and still setting his policy. Can he not see why Emma might think that his party is telling them exactly where to go?
Mr. Speaker, he keeps talking about the mini-budget. I won't ask him a question, Mr. Speaker. Well, I will just point out he did actually support 95% of the things in that mini-budget, which I didn't, Mr. Speaker. But again, he's had a whole summer to get on top of the details. He's still ignoring the fact that rising interest rates are a global challenge. They are at their highest level in America and Europe for more than 20 or 30 years. Mortgage rates have doubled in America, trebled in Europe. Now, what we do want to do to help mortgage holders is ensure that they can use the mortgage charter that we've agreed with the banks. And thanks to the steps that we've taken, someone with a £200,000 property with about £100,000 left on their mortgage could save over £350 a month and lock in a new deal 6 months before theirs ended, and repossessions will be prohibited for 12 months from the first missed payment. He might have missed that policy is twice as generous as Labour's.
Absolutely tone deaf in every cafe, pub and supermarket in Britain having the same conversation. We can't afford that. Put it back on the shelf. It's too expensive. He is completely oblivious, just patting himself on the back. Emily and Jamie have worked hard and saving for years to buy their own home. They were nearly there last year, but he scrapped house building targets because his backbenchers pushed him around. House building has fallen off a cliff, shattering the simple dream of home ownership for people like Emily and Jamie. Can the Prime Minister now see that actually his candidate in Tamworth was just loyally following the party line?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think these prepared lines really aren't working for him anymore. He literally asked a question. He literally asked me a question about the support that we're providing for mortgage holders. I gave him the answer to that question, and then he read from his script to say that we hadn't answered the question. We're providing significant help for all these people. He's moved on to housing targets, but here's the record. 2.5 million additional homes. Housing starts double what we inherited from the Labour Party. Housing supply up 10%, on track to deliver 1 million new homes, and a record number of first-time buyers, Mr. Speaker. But again, he brings up his candidates in Tamworth and Mid-Beds. As we open this session, he's now saying he wants to build homes. Well, both of those candidates want to say that they want to block new homes in their constituency.
Tell us more about
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, across our country, the British people are rolling up their sleeves and getting on with it, doing their best in the face of a punishing cost of living crisis and a government that has abandoned them. Abandoned renters at risk of being kicked out. Abandoned mortgage payers struggling to make ends meet. Abandoned those who dream of owning their own house. The truth is, his candidate in Tamworth summed up perfectly just how his and his Tories are treating the British public. So will he just call a general election and give the British public the chance to respond, as they did in Selby, Mid-Beds and Tamworth? They've heard the government telling them to F off, and they want the chance to return the compliment.
Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, look, as we saw with his recent decisions on actually building new houses, politicians like him always take the easy way out, Mr. Speaker, whereas we're getting on making the right long-term decisions to change this country for the better on net zero, on HS2, on a smoke-free generation, on education and energy security. Contrast that to his leadership. Too cautious to say anything and hope that nobody notices, Mr. Speaker. Let me tell him, come that general election, the British people will.
I said "ho," not more. Ho.
It's the first time I've been confused with the Leader of the Opposition, Mr. Speaker.
There's been many rumours about you.
It will be soon. And all of them true, Mr. Speaker. Like me, my right honourable friend has the honour and privilege of representing a rural constituency. I'm sure he, like I, occasionally feels a certain degree of frustration that whilst progress has been made in this area, the rubric of funding formulae for things like the Environment Agency, local government, the police and education still fails to adequately reflect the difficulties and challenges of delivering public service in rural areas. Can my right honourable friend, the Chancellor and the wider government use the opportunities of both the autumn statement and the forthcoming budget to explore these issues further, to give a better delivery of service for his constituents and for mine?
Can I thank my honourable friend for raising this important issue on behalf of both his and my constituents. It's vital that we have the same high-quality services in rural areas as well as our towns and cities. I am pleased to tell him that we're providing £95 million through the Rural Services Delivery Grant to help rural councils achieve exactly that. We are currently reviewing the police funding formula, and I remember working with him to ensure that the national funding formula for schools does take account of the differing characteristics of schools and their pupils. But we will continue to keep all these things under review, and I agree with them entirely. Our rural communities must be given the same funding and public services as everyone else in our country.
SNP Deputy Leader Murray Black.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the UN warned that hospitals in Gaza had just 48 hours of fuel left to keep their electricity going. That was 28 hours ago. The electricity runs out tonight. Now, we have a human responsibility to all the people in Gaza, but we have a particular responsibility for UK citizens, some of whom are in those hospitals with no food, no water, no medicine and no way out. So I want to ask the Prime Minister, how much worse does the situation have to get before he will join us in calls for a humanitarian ceasefire?
Mr. Speaker, from the start, we have said that the first and most important principle is that Israel has the right to defend itself under international law. Our support for that position is absolute and unchanged. But from the start, we have also said that we do want British nationals to be able to leave Gaza, and that we want hostages to be released and for humanitarian aid to get in. And we recognise that for all of that to happen, there has to be a safer environment, which of course necessitates specific pauses as distinct from a ceasefire. And we discussed this with partners yesterday evening at the United Nations. And we have also been consistently clear that everything must be done to protect civilians in line with international law and continue getting more aid flowing into Gaza.
Murray Black.
Mr. Speaker, the growing calls for a ceasefire is also about calming the situation in the broader region, especially the West Bank. UNICEF has reported over 2,000 fatalities and over 5,000 injured children since the conflict began due to unrelenting attacks. If we ignore this, we risk pouring petrol on a fire in a place that only requires a spark to ignite. Can the Prime Minister understand that joining calls for a ceasefire is now the best and maybe the only way to stop this conflict escalating beyond all control?
Mr. Speaker, we do have to remember that Israel has suffered a shockingly brutal terrorist attack. Hamas is responsible for this conflict and has the right to protect itself in line with international law. As the UN Charter makes clear, we will continue to urge the Israelis to follow international law, whilst we also have to remember that Hamas cruelly embeds itself in civilian populations. But we are doing everything we can to get aid into the region. I'm pleased to say an RAF flight left the UK this morning for Egypt carrying 21 tonnes of aid for Gaza. The relief supplies include over 75,000 medical kits, solar lights, water filters for families and warehousing equipment. Our team are on the ground ready to receive. We will continue to do everything we can to increase the flow of aid, including fuel, into Gaza.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the matter of Wally's Quarry, my constituents in Newcastle-under-Lyme have been utterly let down and failed by the Environment Agency. Not only have they failed to prosecute a rogue operator for the repeated breaches of their permit, we now learn that all of their monitoring equipment for the last 7 years, including in your constituency, Mr. Speaker, has been grossly under-recording levels of hydrogen sulphide by a factor of approximately 2 or 3 times. That's the monitoring equipment that people have been relying on to tell them that their air is safe and clean to breathe. Given everything that's happened, we really need to see some proper action now. I've had enough with the EA, and my constituents have too. So will the Prime Minister do everything in his power to get a grip on this failing organisation?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right to raise the concerns of his constituents. The Environment Agency's criminal investigation is ongoing, so I hope he can understand that I can't therefore comment further on it. But with regard to his concerns about the measurement inaccuracies, I have been assured and checked the Environment Agency is working swiftly to understand the scale of the problem. The Environment Secretary is currently monitoring the situation, and I have asked that she keeps my honourable friend regularly updated.
Mr. Speaker, a few short months ago the world came to Belfast to celebrate the Good Friday Agreement. At the heart of that agreement was the realisation that we could not use violence as a tool for revenge or to achieve our political aims. As 1,400 Israelis and almost 6,000 Palestinians lay dying and dead, when will the Prime Minister say enough is enough? When will he call for a ceasefire? When will he tell Israel to stop meting out collective punishment on the people of Gaza? And when will he and other world leaders insist on a political solution that involves a Palestinian state for the Palestinian people?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I said, an important principle is that Israel does have the right to defend itself under international law to ensure that attacks like this, which were brutal and horrific for their citizens, can't happen again, and we continue to support that position. But as I said from the start, we've also wanted to ensure humanitarian aid can go in and hostages and nationals can come out. We recognise that that means there has to be a safer environment, which of course necessitates specific pauses as distinct from a ceasefire, and we discussed exactly this with our international partners yesterday at the United Nations and will continue to do so. And as I made clear on Monday, we have doubled down on our efforts to find a better future for the Palestinian people. It's been a feature of all our diplomacy in the region, and we will continue to give all our efforts to making that happen.
Robin Moore. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For too long, Bradford Council have failed to represent the best interests of my constituents, whether it be their catastrophic failures on children's services, their inability to invest our own council tax back into Keighley and Ilkley, or their refusal to instigate a review into child sexual exploitation across the Bradford district. Local residents and I are fed up of being ignored by Bradford Council, and we want out. So will the Prime Minister meet with me to discuss my case for leaving Bradford Council and creating our own unitary authority which better represents Keighley and Ilkley, putting our priorities first?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, I know my honourable friend is a passionate campaigner on this issue, indeed even introducing a private members bill earlier on it this year, and I agree with him that his council should be working to ensure that it delivers good services for all its residents, including his constituents. I will certainly arrange for the relevant minister to discuss his concerns further, and as he didn't do it, maybe I can plug his event this afternoon, I believe, in the Jubilee Room, the Keighley and Ilkley Showcase, where perhaps the minister can come to discuss it in person then.
William Morris.
It's just a year ago now that the new Prime Minister promised to unite our country, not with words, but with action. Quite rightly, voters make a judgment on actions. But in my constituency, as in many others, the Prime Minister hasn't delivered on his promises. Arbroath House in Easington Colliery is a GP practice without the funding to deliver basic community health services. Communities like Shotton, South Hetton, Hassel and Horden lack the police officers to tackle crime and antisocial behaviour. We see sewage being dumped on our coastline at Seaham and Blackhall without prosecution of the privatised water companies. We see investment for levelling up blocked for Horden. When will the Prime Minister call a general election and let Labour rise to the task of rebuilding Britain?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman raised crime. I'm pleased to say that crime is now down by over 50% since Labour were last in office, and that includes significant reductions in antisocial behaviour, which he mentioned. And indeed, earlier this year, not only did we meet our pledge to deliver 20,000 more police officers, a record number on our streets, our antisocial behaviour plan is already making a difference, delivering immediate justice and clamping down on that type of activity.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rightly support the government's plans to build more homes and ease housing shortages. However, I have significant concerns about the impacts of developments on our ageing drainage systems and the potential risks that this poses for flooding, as we're seeing in places like the Hazel Walls development in Uttoxeter. What steps will the government take to ensure that as more houses are built, existing infrastructure is also upgraded and maintained by local authorities to ensure it's not overwhelmed with additional use and less permeable surfaces?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, as my honourable friend knows, our traditional drainage systems are under increasing pressure, and that compares with the benefits of sustainable drainage systems, which work in a different way. It was already a requirement that sustainable drainage systems should be given priority in any major new developments and developments in flood risk areas. But earlier this year, we committed to requiring sustainable drainage systems in all new developments, in top of DEFRA's Plan for Water, which puts a statutory duty on water companies produce plans to set out how they will improve, maintain and extend our robust and resilient wastewater systems.
Charlotte.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This morning I hosted the MS Society and people living with multiple sclerosis to hear about their experiences accessing personal independence payments. 10 years on from its introduction, people with MS and other fluctuating conditions are still too often being denied the support that they deserve to manage the extra costs of their condition and to retain their independence for longer. 22,524 people with MS have signed a petition calling for a full review of PIP for fluctuating conditions, which is on its way to Downing Street right now. Will the Prime Minister listen to their call?
Mr. Speaker, I'm very sorry to hear about the experiences of those suffering with MS that she mentions. I'll ensure the Work and Pension Secretary looks at their concerns and writes to the Honourable Lady.
Sir Peter Bottomley, Father of the House.
We know some duck serious questions today, aiming for electoral advantage in the future. Can I note that the Prime Minister prefers to take decisions that will benefit the country now and the longer term, so that we can have more jobs, better education and a shared prosperity?
Prime Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for his kind words.
Mr. Speaker, while the final report of the infected blood inquiry has been postponed until March, Sir Brian Langstaff, the independent chair, has already published his recommendations on compensation for victims of that scandal. Can the Prime Minister explain why his government insists on postponing its response until after publication of the final report, kicking it into the long grass and delaying justice once again for my constituents Justine, Rachel and Paul, whose fathers died died as a result of that scandal, as well as thousands of others across these aisles.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as I said previously from the dispatch box, what happened was an appalling tragedy, and my heart goes out to all of those affected and their families. I've given extensive evidence to the inquiry, so my position on this matter is on the record, but I would say there is extensive work that has been going on in government for a long time, coordinated by the Minister for the Cabinet Office, as well as interim payments of £100,000 being made to those who are affected.
Simon Baines.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has been a great champion of transport projects on the Welsh borders, including the electrification of the main line in North Wales, the reopening of Corwin Station and the Gabowen to Oswestry line, and also substantial levelling up fund investment in the Llangollen and Montgomery canals. Would the Prime Minister now deliver on the long-awaited Pan-Llanymynech bypass and also prioritise the dualling of the A5, A483 in Clwyd South and North Shropshire?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we are making significant improvements to our cross-border rail services across the Union. Thanks to our decision on HS2, we can now provide an unprecedented £1 billion of investment to fund the electrification of the North Wales main line that will ensure reliable, punctual journeys between North Wales and multiple cities across west of England. We also are continuing to develop the Llanymynech bypass scheme in our next round of the road investment plans, and this section of the A5 in England will be considered by National Highways as part of the Midlands to Gloucestershire to Wales route strategy.
Lillian Greenwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's important that the COVID inquiry has all the relevant documents. That's what the public, including thousands of bereaved families, expect and deserve. But despite being a self-described tech bro, the Prime Minister has been unable to locate and provide his WhatsApp messages to the inquiry. Does he agree that devices should be handed over to experts to retrieve this information?
Mr. Speaker, both the government and I have fully cooperated to provide tens of thousands of documents to the COVID inquiry, and I look forward to giving evidence later this year.
Peter Aldous.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. With the ongoing national crisis in NHS dentistry being raised here most weeks, can my right honourable friend advise as to when the dentistry plan produced by the Department of Health will be published? And can he ensure that any clawed back unspent funds are ring-fenced for NHS dentistry so as to deal with emergencies and to help clear the backlog?
Mr. Speaker, we're investing £3 billion into NHS dentistry, and the reformed dental contract is helping to improve NHS access for patients. In the last year, I'm pleased to say NHS dental activity also increased by almost a quarter compared to the year before, but the forthcoming dental recovery plan, which will be out shortly, will include action to incentivise dentists to deliver even more NHS care.
Ruth Cabret.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is an honour to be elected to this place, and the standards by which we are expected to abide matter. So does the Prime Minister accept that it was ill-judged for him to fail to declare to Parliament that companies linked to his wife had benefited to the tune of £2 million from a fund he had set up as Chancellor? Will he correct the record now? Shocking.
Mr. Speaker, it's worth bearing in mind that the Labour frontbenchers backed the Future Fund when it was introduced. Indeed, they were calling for more funding for it, not less. The House will be aware of my wife's shareholdings in various British startups, so that's her career, which are on the record, and I'm happy to put on the record again. But it is worth bearing in mind that the Future Fund helped over 1,200 different companies. Neither the government nor the British Business Bank chose any of those specific investments. It was open to any British firm that met the criteria.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Speaker, the UK is at risk of being left behind on hydrogen engines, hydrogen ice. The EU and the USA are now recognising hydrogen combustion engines as zero emissions and are supporting their industries as all viable zero carbon technologies will be needed, particularly for our HGVs, according to the RHA. So I'm working with Borg Warner Fenia on ice and many MPs because this is crucial for UK jobs, skills and manufacturing. Will my right honourable friend commit to urgently extending the scope of the Automotive Transformation Fund industrialisation grants to include hydrogen engines so we win the ice race?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the government is determined to ensure that the UK remains one of the best locations in the world for automotive manufacturing. Hydrogen fuel cells and their upstream supply chain are already in scope of the ATF, and support for this fund has enabled Johnson Matthey's £60 million investment in Hertfordshire to develop hydrogen technologies. But I am told by the Minister that DBT are continuing to look at the future possibilities for renewable hydrogen and will consider the fund's eligibility in light of the new developments in this space.
Yasmin Qureshi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's an email in my inbox from a constituent who has family in Gaza. It reads, "My heart can't handle this anymore. We are being massacred, relentlessly bombed, homes are being destroyed, no water, no food, no electricity. Save the Children reported that one child is killed every 15 minutes. And as I speak, the lives of 130 babies in incubators are in danger if fuel does not reach their hospital in time. This is collective punishment of the Palestinian people in Gaza for crimes they did not commit. How many more innocent Palestinians must die before this Prime Minister calls for humanitarian ceasefire?"
Well, Mr. Speaker, I welcome that there is, in fact, unity across these dispatch boxes on Israel's right to defend itself in face of an unspeakable act of terror. But it is also clear that we must support the Palestinian people. They are victims of Hamas too. Hamas uses innocent people as human shields, and we mourn the loss of every innocent life, people of every faith, of every nationality, and we are working as hard as we can to get as much humanitarian aid into Gaza as quickly as practically possible.
Final question, Dr. Dan Poulter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, Suffolk experienced its worst local floods for over 100 years, with communities in and around Needham Market, Framlingham, Debenham and Wickham Market particularly badly affected. Homes and businesses have been destroyed. And Suffolk, the community, has rallied together in a very stoic and pragmatic way to support those in need at this very difficult time. But what longer-term support can the Prime Minister offer to the people in Suffolk, those businesses and homes that have been affected by these floods, to help them to recover and rebuild?
Well, flooding is a devastating experience, and I extend my sympathies to all those affected, including those in his own constituency. I'm pleased to say that that's why, through the flood recovery framework, we are confirming additional financial support for those households and businesses most affected. This will include a £500 grant for households, council tax discounts and business rates relief of up to 100% for 3 months. Small and medium-sized businesses will also be eligible for £2,500 business recovery grant and up to £5,000 grants for flooded homes to make them more resilient for future flooding. We recognise the heroic efforts, Mr. Speaker, of local councils like his and emergency responders everywhere who have been working tirelessly in affected areas. They have our thanks, and we also stand ready to consider any requests from councils for support in their recovery efforts.
That completes questions. I'll come to point one in a second.
So Rishi Sunak there with the issue of flooding at the end of that Prime Minister's questions, but of course dominated by the reaction to the by-election results. We're joined in the studio here by Labour MP for Birmingham Selly Oak, Steve McCabe, who is a member too of the Friends of Israel group in the Labour Party, and indeed I think visited Israel back in 2019. And we have Conservative MP for the Isle of Wight, Bob Seeley. He'll be reflecting on the flooding there as well. But we should mention, Bob, you were former foreign correspondent and a British Army captain. having served in Afghanistan, Iraq, taken on ISIS operations. So you've been at the sharp end.
No, right.
Yeah, anyway, let's just reflect first on the whole issue of the by-election fallout. And not a bad line from the Prime Minister about the new member for Mid-Beds might actually support me a little bit more than the last one. Who could that be?
I thought it was a great line, I have to say. Very self-effacing, and I think he diffused it really well. I think for me, look, two things about the PMQs. Firstly, I know I'm going to say I'm not going to be supporting Keir Starmer. My God, he does drag on. He knows how to kill a punchline, doesn't he?
Well, just in sort of style rather than substance.
And when Rishi gives him a direct answer to the question, Starmer comes back just reading as if Rishi hasn't answered the question. So I thought Rishi actually just shot him down really well. And look, he had big targets today. Keir Starmer had 2 by-election victories. OK, admittedly, Labour have picked up literally 1,000 votes in both, so it's actually the Conservatives not turning out, and actually people punishing bad MPs, to put it bluntly, yeah? So we have 2 by-election defeats. But actually, I thought Rishi handled it brilliantly. I thought Keir Starmer kept on missing his chances. The other thing I would say is just, I want to big up some of my colleagues here. You see a difference of quality between Labour MPs, Steve notwithstanding. You see a difference in quality between Labour MPs and Tory MPs. Fabulous Tory MPs like Siobhan in Stroud, Robbie in Keighley, who else? Aaron Bell in Westminster under Lyme, asking really important questions on national issues which matter to their constituents. And you listen to Labour MPs, they're just banging on.
But maybe not your candidate in Tamworth who told people to F off, which the Starmer picked up on.
He's absolutely right to go on that, and I thought he handled it really well.
OK.
Steve, plenty of calls, although I don't think they're going to go anywhere, for a general election from your leader.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think after the results in Mid-Beds and Tamworth, that's hardly a surprise. I think Bob and I must have been watching a different PMQs. I'd certainly say it wasn't a vintage performance, but, you know, I feel a bit sorry for Sunak, really. I mean, if you have to defend a situation where you've lost 2 rock-solid Tory seats, where the MP has had to go in disgrace in one of them, and then the candidate turns out to be a foul-mouthed lout to succeed him. It's hardly surprising the guy's had a tough day. And, you know, as far as Bob's wonderful backbench performances, I think the award for the most obsequious and irrelevant question of the day must go to the father of the house.
Well, Peter Bottomley, and I think I have to say...
That's very disrespectful, Steve.
Yeah, but I
don't think you heard that question either.
Sunak was scratching his head on that one, wasn't he?
Well, I just think he needs a bit of love and love and support, and Peter Bottomley supplied it.
Let's just reflect, though, that we've had the Prime Minister on the international stage playing, you know, a crucial role in terms of the international diplomacy. It came to the SNP to ask a question on the situation in Israel and Gaza.
Yes, and so your question about that, I mean, why is that necessary?
Why did the Prime Minister not make more, perhaps, of the fact that, you know, he was seen on the world stage doing his job as an international statesman?
But I think because the Labour Party, for justifiable reasons, decided not to go on that this week. So look,
because it's so sensitive and so difficult.
As the Speaker says, you know, the Prime Minister is there to answer questions, so he has to answer the questions that he's being asked. So for sure, and we've had a lot of debate about what's been happening in Gaza for the last couple of weeks, and I think. Yeah, I mean, I think that he announced today, he did get it out, there was 21 tonnes of aid.
Yes, an RAF flight
that left earlier this morning.
Which is really important, and we are trying to get that humanitarian corridor.
One thing he mentioned, actually, because this has been incredibly contentious, hasn't it, this lack of fuel not getting into Gaza. Yeah. The Prime Minister did seem to indicate that he would be pushing for that fuel.
He is. I think there are 2 really important points to make here, and that for everyone who says that there is a certain attitude, and I know that Steve's done sterling, I'll give Steve his credit, he's done really sterling work as Labour Friends of Israel to clear out some of the really revolting toxicity that the Labour Party's had and that you have on the left about this Israelophobia, masking anti-Semitism. So credit to him to do that. We still need to make sure that Israel behaves according to international law. Nothing justifies the slaughter of toddlers that we saw from the Hamas.
Do you
2 or
think
3 weeks
Israel
ago.
is behaving according to international law?
They need to do so, and that's not...
Are they now?
That's not... I hope they are. I'm not there. I'm here. I hope they are, and it's really important that they do, because it's not negotiable. You can support Israel, and you can say, absolutely, they have the right to go and kill all the Hamas terrorists.
Yeah.
That's what they are.
And that is an act of self-defense.
You can't... Keir Starmer, with great respect to him, was wrong to say it's OK to cut off water. It isn't.
Right.
So you need to uphold the international law here.
We are going to speak to Chris Hope, our political editor, on this, because there is a meeting immediately after PMQs this afternoon. But Bob Seeley, Stephen McCabe, as Bob Seeley was saying, that the whole question is what Israel's entitled to do. You are a member of the Friends of Israel.
I'm the chair, actually.
And the chair, I do beg your pardon.
Okay.
But there is a difficulty here for Keir Starmer and what he said, and the fact that all these councillors are already starting to actually resign over this.
In Oxford, they lost their Labour majority.
Well, look, let's be clear here. On the issue of fuel, I mean, Hamas are sitting on 500,000 litres of fuel. Why don't they give that to the Palestinian people? Just the other week, they stole 24,000 litres from a UN depot. That's enough to keep a hospital
which is why
going
Israel
for
is saying
4
we're not
days.
going to let the fuel supplies through the border.
Why don't Hamas give some of the fuel they're sitting on? And as far as water is concerned, Israel provides 5% of water to Gaza. Hamas are responsible for the rest. What are they doing? So you cannot have a situation... I'm totally in favour of humanitarian support going to the Palestinian people, but you cannot expect Israel, after what they've suffered, to give succour to the people who have attacked them and massacred their civilians. That is just not acceptable.
Because their view is Hamas is directly in control of the fuel supplies as basically the administration.
As I say, they're sitting on 500,000 litres. Why can't that go to the Palestinian people?
So the calls for the humanitarian ceasefire...
No, a humanitarian pause in order to get aid
lull
directly.
rather than a ceasefire.
Well, you can't have a ceasefire against a terrorist operation that's attacking you. I mean, that is absolutely ludicrous. Can you imagine if that was happening in this country?
Yeah. And that's the situation with Washington as well. They've made that fairly plain. Well, let's just bring in Chris Hope, our political editor in Westminster, because, Chris, we do have this meeting, we understand, where Keir Starmer is meeting representatives and particularly Muslim MPs as well on this question of what he said about water and power in Gaza.
That's right, and I think that's the tension going forward with this conflict and the issue in Israel. It's very easy for the first 2 weeks for Labour to hold the line, notably at the party conference when all the protesters were kept outside of the secure area. But increasingly that is weakening, and there are real issues here. Starmer right now is meeting, along with key members of the shadow cabinet, with these Muslim MPs and peers to try and discuss how Labour's position might change, because the issue is whether there should be a ceasefire. We heard, didn't we, in PMQs just then, how Rishi Sunak talked about maybe a pause to allow some water, even some fuel to get in, which, of course, Stephen McCabe says they've got enough. But the SNP deputy leader there, Mari Black, saying, in fact, that there's a shortage of fuel within Gaza. So I think it's fascinating how that's changing. I think that will become an issue here for the Tories to pick away with the Labour Party as they try and hold that line to support Israel's right to defend itself, while also dealing with the issue of the emerging humanitarian disaster in Gaza.
Yeah, but direct facts of humanitarian with this RAF flight on the way, the Prime Minister taking the opportunity at the dispatch box there to underline that.
Yeah, he says 75,000 medical kits are going there, 21 tonnes of aid. Of course, the government has doubled the amount of aid going towards Gaza. It's now probably it will be on its way to Egypt, waiting to get into the southern border. But there's pressure here on what to do next. I think this whole idea of how Starmer can hold together this alliance supporting Israel is vital. From the beginning, we heard, didn't we, how Keir Starmer has tried to support the PM, Rishi Sunak, on all areas of national security. Yeah. This is one area where it may be more and more difficult to hold that coalition together.
OK. Let's bring our MPs back in. Chris, for the moment, thank you for that. Particularly, Bob, with your expertise, having, you've literally been on the ground in these operations. We've got Washington and even London perhaps suggesting to the Israelis, don't go in, don't do this until you're absolutely sure you can achieve something. And the hostages as well, and clearly there's a question mark as to where they are and how well they're being treated.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know where to start with this. It's such a horrible situation. This is called fighting in built-up areas, so it's
urban warfare.
It's horrible, and it's the most dangerous thing. And once Israelis commit troops, Israel commits troops into the Gaza Strip, it is going to become incredibly difficult for them. However much they bomb, hopefully within the bounds of the law, however much they bomb, and you're dealing then with the slaughter of hostages, you're dealing with the presentation of hostages on the media. This will drag out. I mean, a good situation is hundreds of and I say good in inverted commas, is hundreds of Palestinians dead and only dozens of Israelis dead, and that is probably a lower case of the casualty outcome. So, but again, the Israelis are rightly going to say we have the right to deal with Hamas because a political organisation, which the former leader of the Labour Party, Hamas, described as his friends, yet beheading toddlers.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, praise to Steve.
Who's no longer a Labour MP.
Yeah, absolutely. And praise to Steve for helping to detoxify the Labour Party. You know, people who behead toddlers should not be your friends. So they have a right to an ongoing operation. It is an incredibly complex operation. It will become even more complex and violent and morally confusing if they send in troops, but they have the right to do it. But the problem is the Hamas operates in and around a civilian population and will manipulate that civilian population to maximum effect.
Is it actually doable? Because we learned the lesson in Mosul, I think, particularly, where I think the Israelis were actually part of that operation going after ISIS, and it was just incredible. It took years.
The problem with... I remember the Mosul operation because I was not too far away at the time. The Mosul operation and the Raqqa operations as well, it's probably true to say that the civilian casualties were higher at the time than, frankly, people would have liked, because there was more, it's a horrible phrase, collateral damage. I don't use it in some flippant, light way. It's just you have the rules of war, which Israel has and Hamas does not. Excuse me, but if your rules of war says you can have 6 casualties for a blast if you're killing a Hamas terrorist or destroying a Hamas cell, then clearly you are going to get collateral human life damage. It's just the question of what those rules are and making sure you don't hit the wrong building. So even if the Israelis were not responsible, which is almost certainly true for the hospital bombing, and that was almost certainly Hamas, even then you're dealing, they're not going to get every strike right. So it's a horribly complex situation.
There'll be arms dumps that will explode and so on.
And the Israelis are going to get the blame because there is still too many people who say, if in doubt, blame Israel.
This is the problem as well, is that we keep seeing this death toll in Gaza rising and rising. Now, we know that the health ministry is run by Hamas, Steve, but the latest figure is 6,546 Palestinians dead, 2,704 children since October the 7th. And many people would say a child's life in Palestine is worth the same as a child's life in Israel.
Well, look, I deplore the death of any innocent civilian, any innocent child in a conflict like this. And I don't know many reasonable people who would think differently. I don't have any faith in the Hamas figures that are being quoted. No. And, you know, I think it was the Prime Minister who said the other week you wouldn't treat figures from the Kremlin at face value. Why aren't we treating Hamas figures?
But we can see from the images that we see on all news channels what the situation in Gaza is, the number of...
There are
injured,
undoubtedly casualties. I'm not trying to deny that. But the reality is, it's not the Hamas leadership who are suffering the casualties. They're in their secure bunkers under Gaza City. They've got plenty of food, water, electricity. They are protected and they are preventing innocent Palestinians from going to safe areas in the south of Gaza where they could actually be supported. So, you know, let's not pretend here. Israel are the victims in this situation. Their civilian population was massacred.
Oh, listen, none of this detracts from what happened on October the 7th. Absolutely,
and
absolutely
now they are
not.
being criticised for attempting to rescue hostages and attempting to deal with a vicious, brutal terrorist organisation.
Can I put it to you that Hamas at the moment maybe appear to be winning the international propaganda
They're very
war.
good at propaganda. I totally
I'm
agree.
just looking at what Turkey, Erdogan, said earlier, where he made this, assertion that Hamas was not a terrorist organisation, that they were basically seeking liberation, and anyone who was implying that they should not be carrying out what they are was, I think, mad. They had a mental illness.
Well, in this country, they are a
this is someone who's a NATO member.
Yes, in this country, they're a prescribed terrorist group. We are under no illusions about them. But yes, I agree, they are winning a propaganda war, and that's why people in this country, MPs and everyone else, should deal with a great deal of caution what they say about the actions that are occurring in Palestine, because it is essentially Hamas propaganda they are relying on.
Yeah, and is it the fact that Hamas have actually worked out a chess game and they know exactly what the reaction was going to be and drawing Israel into this diplomatic fire?
Yeah, sadly, that may well be the case. I mean, there's an argument to suggest they've overplayed their hand, and there's an argument, I was reading a piece in The Spectator this morning saying in the same way that Enniskillen, the bombing and Remembrance Sunday, discredited significantly the IRA and led to the peace talks, it might be that they've overplayed their hand so badly now that actually Hamas's allies, and Hamas is the sort of Muslim Brotherhood terrorist splinter, but the Turkish government and also Qatar, have a sort of Muslim Brotherhood link. So
and Egypt.
Formerly in Egypt, but then obviously the military coup changed that. So Hamas is clearly wanting to frame the debate as the Jews are killing Arabs, and that Jews are killing Muslims. There's also a really important angle here, which is Iran. This is kicked off now because Iran did not want to see a normalization of relations between Israel and Sunni Muslim Arab states, primarily Saudi, but normalised relationships already with the UAE, effectively with Egypt, obviously for a couple of decades, but also with Morocco. So that's
why Tehran decided to move.
Yeah. Well, Tehran probably pushed Hamas heavily. Right. Hamas has some independence of thought, but if you're taking $100 million plus a year from your paymasters and they're giving you the rocket technology, when they tell you when to push those rockets, you're going to push those rockets. And so one can't take out, although Hamas are Sunni themselves, there is a really important sheer link here with the Iranians and with the IRGC and the destabilisation throughout the Middle East that the IRGC are trying to navigate.
I mean, there's a view that Netanyahu is very hesitant. He's struggling to make a decision about the timing of this ground invasion, and that could be because of the risk of this descending, not just because of the hostages, but about this wider conflict. I think we can see live pictures now from the northern Israeli border.
I think the Americans have actually been, I think Biden's been very sensible here. They've said, look, go after Hamas, and Steve's right, they're hidden in bunkers. It's not the kids that are in the bunkers, it's the murderers and their bosses, the murderers' bosses. They're in the bunkers and they're going to be safe, or, they may be killed eventually.
Send the foot soldiers to die for the cause.
And victims. As long as you can present victims to the world, then you can say Israel's killing innocents, and that's what they want.
Yes. Right. Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for that. And, of course, we'll keep monitoring the situation. But very quickly, Bob, while you're here, as a constituency MP, you've got real problems down in the Isle of Wight.
We have. I think you're going to get Victoria, who's a lovely lady from East Cowes, who's going to be on just after 1 o'clock talking about our flooding. Just in case any folks are on the Isle of Wight, there's lots of information that's gone out on my website in the last last hour, about all the stuff. That is Victoria there, with the green jumper on, and that's East Cowes, and that's her charity centre there, which is a great place, which was just recently done up, I think, about a year ago.
Yeah, and we can see the problems directly there.
Absolutely. So if anyone is lacking any information that's been put up by the council, by Island Roads, by Southern Water, everything is on my Facebook site and has been for the last hour. If there's any questions, people just email me and I will refer you on to the right people. If in doubt, if in danger, dial 999.
Bob, thank you for that, and we will update people from the Isle of Wight in the next hour. Stay with us here on GB News.
In a world of dull and predictable radio and TV shows.
Oh, hi. On Mark Dolan tonight, we've got big guests. We drill into the big stories of the day. The show adds up to a brilliant listening and viewing experience. Mark Dolan Tonight is the most entertaining current affairs show ever, and that's a fact. Join me, Mark Dolan, Fridays and Saturdays from 9, Sundays from 10. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
There's only 3 people you can trust in life. Your doctor, your lawyer, and your nana.
I'm not sure.
So join me, Nana Aquare, at 3 p.m. every Saturday and Sunday, where we discuss the biggest topics of the weekend. Be ready for battle. Could you be quiet? What is this?
It's my new teeth.
It's your new
Yes, I
teeth.
know.
I don't bite. Well, not without a good reason. Always honest, always fun. Every weekend at 3 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Kerr, we tackle the issues of the day with real, robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute. Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's, at drive time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app, and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christie's, on GB News and GB News Radio.
Good afternoon, it is 1 o'clock and this is the live desk here on GB News. Coming up this Wednesday lunchtime.
Now the diplomatic storm in the Middle East. Israel calls for UN Secretary-General to resign after he said Palestinians had been subjected to 56 years of suffocating occupation.
New fears that the conflict could escalate. Pictures released by the Israelis show Hamas attacks from the sea, suggesting it has significant firepower. Our security editor Mark White has the latest from Tel Aviv.
In the Commons at PMQs, Rishi Sunak faces Sir Keir Starmer for the first time since the by-election defeats. The fallout from that, clashing over housing, cost of living, but appearing to be united over Israel.
A police officer who blackmailed and threatened underage girls to send him explicit photos of themselves on Snapchat is jailed for life. We'll be live outside Cardiff Crown Court.
And yet more weather warnings, this time for the south of England, with the Isle of Wight left badly hit by flooding, extensive damage to homes and roads. We'll have the latest from the scene. First, latest headlines with Ray.
Good
afternoon, it's 1 minute past 1. Our top stories this hour. Israel intensified airstrikes on Gaza overnight as world leaders called for a pause in fighting for humanitarian aid. The military says it targeted Hamas infrastructure, including a weapons warehouse. The Palestinian Health Ministry, which is run by Hamas, says 756 people, including 344 children, have been killed in the past 24 hours. It brings the total to more than 6,500 since October the 7th. The Israeli Defense Forces also say the Navy spotted terrorists exiting a tunnel onto a beach on the Strip. They were killed when they tried to enter Israeli territory by sea. Well, there are growing concerns that the conflict could spread across the region. Leaders of terrorist groups reportedly met to discuss a so-called resistance axis against Israel. Lebanon's Hezbollah leader is said to have held talks with Palestinian militant factions, Hamas and Islamic Jihad. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak stopped short of calling for a ceasefire, despite pressure from more than 80 MPs to do so. We're showing you now live pictures from Gaza. Instead, the PM backed specific pauses in the conflict to allow for the safe delivery of humanitarian aid to the Strip. The Ministry of Defence has confirmed that the first load of supplies from the UK is now on its way to Egypt, with an RAF plane carrying 21 tonnes of aid, including medical equipment and water filters. A former South Wales police officer has been jailed for life with a minimum of 12 years for sexual offences against children. Lewis Edwards used fake social media accounts and posed as a teenager to groom more than 200 young girls online. He forced his victims to take indecent videos and images of themselves, using the material to blackmail them. In sentencing, the judge described his behaviour as cruel and sadistic and said he posed a dangerous risk to children. 2 Metropolitan Police officers have been found guilty of gross misconduct over the stop and search of 2 black athletes. Ricardo dos Santos and his partner Bianca Williams were stopped in their car in London in 2020. Nothing was found, no arrests were made, with the pair publicly accusing the force of racism. Initially, 5 officers were investigated. All of them denied any wrongdoing. The panel found both PC Jonathan Clapham and PC Sam Franks guilty. 3 people have been arrested on suspicion of criminal damage after Just Stop Oil activists sprayed London's Wellington Arch orange. The group posted footage online as they demanded the government end new oil and gas. The video shows activists covering the almost 200-year-old Grade 1 listed structure with paint before setting off orange flares. Rishi Sunak has been quizzed on the cost of living crisis during Prime Minister's questions on his first anniversary as Tory leader. The Labour leader accused the Conservatives of crashing the economy, raising the case of one family whose mortgage went up by a quarter. Rishi Sunak responded by saying his government's policy to cope with rising interest rates is twice as generous as Labour's would be, and that the opposition has a track record of U-turns. However, Sir Keir says the British public continues to be abandoned by this government.
Truth is, his candidate in Tamworth summed up perfectly just how his and his Tories are treating the British public. So will he just call a general election and give the British public the chance to respond, as they did in Selby, Mid-Beds and Tamworth? They've heard the government telling them to F off, and they want the chance to return the compliment.
As we saw with his recent decisions on actually building new houses, politicians like him always take the easy way out, Mr. Speaker. Whereas we're getting on making the right long-term decisions to change this country for the better on net zero, on HS2, on a smoke-free generation, on education and energy security. Contrast that to his leadership. Too cautious to say anything and hope that nobody notices, Mr. Speaker. Let me tell him, come that general election, the British people will.
And finally, an all-British mission could be heading into orbit for the first time ever. The UK Space Agency has signed an agreement with Axiom Space, that's an American-based firm, to try to make it happen. Astronauts would spend up to 2 weeks carrying out scientific experiments and participate in educational activities. This is GB News across the UK on TV, in your car, on digital radio and on your smart speaker by saying, play GB News. Now let's get back to Mark and Pip.
Ray, thanks very much. Welcome back to the live desk with what now seems to be a diplomatic battle raging. Israel demanding the resignation of the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, saying he is no longer fit to lead the United Nations. He'd linked Hamas's attack to what he called Israel's 56 years of suffocating occupation of Palestine.
Israel has responded by blocking visas for UN officials, claiming that Gutierrez's comments appear to condone Hamas's massacre of over 1,000 Israeli civilians.
Well, elsewhere, Turkey's President Tayyip Erdogan described Israel's attacks on Gaza as assassination and mental illness. He then went on to assert that Hamas was not a terrorist organisation, but a liberation group, waging a battle to protect its land.
On the ground, Israel has ignored the UN's calls for a ceasefire and appears to be intensifying its strikes against Hamas.
And the IDF said that it's also thwarted a maritime assault by Hamas using specialist frogmen raiding an Israeli beach. Our security editor Mark White has the latest from Tel Aviv.
Just hours after the UN Secretary-General called for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza, this was Israel's response. A further intensification of airstrikes against what Israel says were Hamas positions, including command and control compounds, ammunition stores and rocket launchers. But with many of those Hamas positions right in the centre of residential areas, the toll on Gaza's civilians is enormous. The Hamas-controlled health ministry claimed more than 700 died in the latest round of Israeli strikes. Dismissing the Secretary-General's call for a ceasefire, Israel said it had no intention of easing up on its operation to destroy Hamas. And there is now widespread anger across Israel after Antonio Guterres went on to say that although there was no justification for the attacks on the 7th of October, they did not occur, he said, in a vacuum.
The Palestinian people have been subjected to 56 years of suffocating occupation. They have seen their land steadily devoured by settlements and plagued by violence, their economy stifled, their people displaced, and their homes demolished.
I think that the Secretary General must resign, because from now on, every day that he is here in this building, unless he apologizes immediately, today we called him to apologize, there's no justification to the existence of this building.
There are growing fears here of a widening regional conflict. The head of the Hezbollah terror group in Lebanon has met leaders from Hamas and Islamic Jihad, pledging support for a resistance axis against Israel, which would include help from Iran and Syria. These unverified images claim to show the aftermath of an Israeli strike on Syrian military positions overnight, which the IDF said had been launching rockets into Israel. Syrian authorities say 8 of their soldiers were killed and 7 injured. And in another serious incident, Israel said it killed a group of 8 Hamas terrorists trying to reach Israel by sea to launch an attack in a community north of Gaza. It came on the back of the largest rocket barrage into central Israel since the 7th of October attacks. Across Tel Aviv, people ran for shelters as Iron Dome missile defence systems intercepted multiple Hamas rockets. One struck a community northeast of Tel Aviv, badly damaging a property. With many more burials in Israel and in Gaza, any thoughts of a ceasefire in this conflict must seem a very long way off. Mark White, GB News, Tel Aviv.
And we can talk to Mark White, who is in Tel Aviv. Mark, we've just had Prime Minister's questions here within the last hour. The Prime Minister maintaining the line that Israel has the right to defend itself, but also announcing that an RAF flight is on its way delivering humanitarian aid to Palestinians in Gaza.
Yes, that C-17 flight, heavy lift aircraft, has headed for Egypt with 21 tons of supplies, including medical supplies, water filtration kits and alike. But the difficulty will be, of course, getting it in to Gaza, because at the moment that border is all but closed. They allow a trickle of lorries through each day, but it's no more than a dozen or so trucks. And United Nations Humanitarian Agency is saying that actually it needs to be at least 100 aid supply lorries every day to make a meaningful difference to the lives of those people in Gaza who are suffering, without a doubt, tremendously at the moment because of the way in which the war is being conducted, both by Hamas, the fact that they are placing their compounds, their launchers and the likes in civilian areas, and the fact that Israel is determined to go after Hamas and to take out those launchers, those command and control compounds, and it is not going to enact any kind of ceasefire at this moment.
The other side of that, of course, Mark, is, as we've heard these calls yet again for a ceasefire from within the House of Commons at PMQs, Hamas itself has launched these two major operations, as you were describing, the rocket attacks into central Israel and this extraordinary maritime attack using specialist frogmen.
Well, this is it. Israel is saying quite clearly there is no way that they are going to stop their attempts to degrade and to destroy Hamas. And clearly they haven't done that to any sufficient degree, because that largest barrage of rockets came into central Tel Aviv and other areas of central Israel yesterday, the largest barrage since this conflict began on the 7th of October. So that shows you that there is still no shortage, it seems, of these deadly rockets that Hamas has. And then also launching this audacious attempt to send these scuba divers out into the sea to attack a community just north of Gaza. They were intercepted and killed by the Israeli military and the Israeli Navy. But that shows Israel, they say, that Hamas is still a very significant threat, and they won't rest until they have destroyed it.
And just to pick up on what happened there, they're describing this assault as coming from tunnels from Gaza before they got into the sea and were trying to land on that beach.
Yes, well, you can come out of northern Gaza, and then if you swim out into the sea, of course, there's no border fence into the sea. So one way around it is either to get a vessel, which would be seen, or to try to take on scuba gear and under the surface go into southern Israel that way. But of course, there are very intense eyes at the moment from Israeli intelligence, from drones, satellites, looking down on all of these potential border crossings to make sure there are no further incursions following the events of the 7th of October. So they were pretty quickly onto it. But it shows you the determination of Hamas, despite the clear pummeling that it's getting from Israeli jets and Israeli missiles on a daily basis. It's still determined to launch these attacks.
Mark in Tel Aviv, thank you for that. And, of course, our apologies of some fairly graphic images there in that footage of the aftermath of that raid on that beach.
Well, joining us now live from Jerusalem is a member of the Israeli Knesset, Dan Iluz. Thank you very much for joining us today. Let me just get your take, first of all, on the UN chief's words, the calls for his resignation. Is that something you want to echo? I mean, you're now denying visas, aren't you, to UN representatives as some sort of punishment. Is that the right way, do you think, to handle this?
What the UN Secretary General did was a complete disgrace. I mean, we have to remember that the UN was founded in order to stop exactly the type of massacres as the one that we have seen Hamas commit on October 7th in Israel. And by comparing what happened on October 7th and any other thing that Israel might be right doing or not be right doing, legitimate criticism of Israel is always legitimate. But by comparing these things, it was as if he was comparing a firefighter with an arsonist and trying to make a balance between these two things. We have to be very morally clear. There are times where humanity needs to be clear. When the Nazis were fighting the Western free world, then it was very clear who the good guys and who the bad guys were. When ISIS was fighting against, again, the Western world, Europe, or all of these other places, it was very clear who the good guys were and who the bad guys were. It's also very clear here. Hamas burns people alive, burns babies alive, babies. They rape women and flaunt them around. They abduct elderly without their medication. There's no comparison to be made. There's the good guys, and that's Israel, a modern democracy, a liberal democracy that tries to abide by international law as much as possible. And then there's Hamas, an evil regime that needs to be destroyed.
But is it the case, Stan, that you're having now to fight a diplomatic battle, if I can put it that way? I'm just looking at the remarks from President Erdogan in Turkey. Israel's attacks on Gaza and supporting them amount to assassination or mental illness. He then went on to say Hamas is a liberation group waging a battle to protect its land, not a terrorist organisation. I mean, quite extraordinary remarks, but this is a member of NATO.
I have to say that this is these comments are also outrageous. And just to be clear and precise, there is absolutely no occupation in Gaza. Israel left Gaza in 2005 in the disengagement plan, a plan that I personally opposed because I thought that it was dangerous to Israel. Unfortunately, we saw that it actually was dangerous for Israel. Israel left Gaza in 2005. There's absolutely no occupation in Gaza. That's all fake news that's spread by Hamas supporters who are absolutely evil people who just want to massacre Jews. That's what it's about. It's not about occupation. It's about the genocidal ambitions of Hamas. Now, when you're talking about diplomatic support for Israel, I do have to say that the Western free world is right now very united with Israel. I'm very happy about that. It's a positive sign. I hope that as Israel continues defending itself, they won't forget the reasons that brought us to defend ourselves, and that the reasons that won't let us accept a situation where Hamas survives this war.
Dan, also just to ask you, talking of positive signs, Qatar has said that they hope there will be a breakthrough on hostage releases soon. Could you expand on that at all?
So obviously for Israel, one of the top priorities is the release of the hostages that are currently held by Hamas in Gaza. I remind you, it's from small babies to the very elderly people and all the ages in between that are being held hostages in Gaza. It's a top priority for us, whether we do it militarily or whether we do it diplomatically. All options are on the table. I have to be frank and honest. Qatar is a supporter of Hamas. It's a sponsor of Hamas. It hasn't been a positive force. It's been a force that fueled the hatred of Hamas. And so I'm a little bit skeptical about the things that Qatar says. But any way that we can...
Crucial to these negotiations, though, in terms of getting hostages out. Is Qatar not vital player here, or is Egypt more of a player?
So there are many different players. Obviously, the negotiations can't be discussed on live television, but there are a lot of different players. Some of them are some that you mentioned with. There's a lot of people that want to see the hostages released, and we're hoping for that to happen. The President of the United States also made it very clear that this is one of his top priorities, and we thank him for that.
Daniel Luz, member of the Israeli Parliament, the Knesset, thank you very much for joining us and updating it with your response there. Thank you. More, of course, to come from Israel and, indeed, the other diplomatic response. But also coming up, we're heading to Cardiff Crown Court, where a former policeman has been jailed for life for child sexual abuse and blackmail. Details coming up shortly.
We're here for the show.
More energy
party this time!
Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie. Second best. You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with these three.
Oh!
No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sundays at 9 on GB News.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News.
Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute. Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's, at drive time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christie's, on GB News and GB News Radio.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train.
Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa! Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Well, welcome back to the Live Desk. Now, some of you may find the details in this next report distressing, with a former South Wales police officer, Lewis Edwards, being jailed for life with a minimum of 12 years for sexual offences against children.
He used fake social media accounts posing as a teenager to groom and blackmail more than 200 young girls online using social media platform Snapchat.
Let's get more from outside Cardiff Crown Court now with our reporter Jack Carson. And Jack, he again, as we've seen in other cases, refused to attend the hearing for his sentencing.
Yeah, so this sentencing has gone on since Monday, noting the detail, lots of it very much horrific, of these crimes of child sex offences that Lewis Edwards pleaded guilty to. He denied the chance to appear in court to face that sentencing on Monday, yesterday, as well as today. This is one of the most horrific cases of child sex offences. In fact, in the court today and yesterday as well, both the prosecution and defence noted, and the judge today noted, that the sentencing guidelines, that such was the nature of these offences, that much of them came outside the sentencing guidelines. That's how awful they were. But sentencing Mr. Edwards today, Judge Lloyd Clark said that this defendant had a pattern of behaviour, messaging these girls, masquerading himself himself sometimes as a 14-year-old boy, in some cases pretending to know them, but grooming his victims, psychologically manipulating them until he gained control over them. We heard throughout this week that even when his victims were crying, when they were distressed, when they were asking him to stop, he could have been in no doubt the harm that he was causing them. In some cases, his victims told him that they were self-harming or were considering suicidal thoughts. But he, on one occasion, told one girl that other girls he had done this to had committed suicide, so he did not care if she committed suicide. The court heard this week recorded phone calls that he had with one of the girls, 13-year-old at the time, where he was pleasuring himself during the call. Now, he was a serving police officer for the majority of when these offences took place. These offences took place from November 2020 to February 2023. When he was then arrested and quickly sacked from the police force of South Wales Police following a misconduct hearing. But also telling me, Superintendent Tracy Ranking of South Wales Police told me about the sophistication of the computer network and setup that he had in his home, meaning that South Wales Police had to build special software because of the levels of encryption that he had on his network to protect these images. Many of these images, 4,500 of them in total, 700 of them category A, which refers to images which involve penetration. Many of them were stored in folders indicative of the ages. So there's a degree of sophistication and organisation that Edwards was using for the grooming of his victims here. He will, of course, serve a life sentence. He will be available for parole after a minimum of 12 years, but the judge stressing today to the families, of course, that if parole board deem him not still a danger to the public after those 12 years, he will still remain behind bars, most likely for life.
Yeah, Jack, at Cardiff Crown Court, thank you for that. And again, our apologies for obviously the graphic evidence that was actually presented in that court, but explaining why he is now serving a life sentence.
Now, Prime Minister's questions took place a little earlier with Rishi Sunak facing Sir Keir Starmer for the first time since the recent by-election defeats. The two clashed over housing, the cost of living crisis, but appeared to be united over their support for Israel, with the Prime Minister confirming that an RAF flight had left for Egypt earlier carrying humanitarian aid. Well, Sir Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner, his deputy, are now meeting Muslim MPs and peers.
Well, to explain more, we can speak now to our political correspondent, Olivia Utley. And, Olivia, this refers back to these comments that Keir Starmer made in relation to the water and power supplies to Gaza, and then, well, the resignation of many Labour councillors in the aftermath of that.
Well, absolutely. Just a few weeks ago, Keir Starmer was being praised from the Labour Party and beyond for managing to have such a slick, professional Labour conference where pretty much everyone, every senior Labour official who spoke seemed to be 100% on the side of Israel. Then Keir Starmer did an interview with Nick Ferrari from LBC, who asked him if he thought it was right, I'm paraphrasing here, that Israel had cut off the water supply to Gaza. And Keir Starmer said, yes, I believe Israel does have that right. Well, cue fury, not just from his own backbenches, but from the Labour Party more generally. 23 Labour councillors have now resigned. And Labour MPs are getting, well, lots of them are deeply, deeply concerned about the humanitarian situation in Gaza. And there are others who are worried about the electoral significance of his words too. There are millions of Muslims in the UK who, on the whole, tend to sway, very broad brushstrokes here, but on the whole, the Muslim population tends to sway towards the Labour Party. Labour MPs in areas where there are a lot of Muslims are very worried that comments such as the ones that Keir Starmer made over the weekend could change all of that. Keir Starmer is meeting with a group of Labour Muslim MPs earlier, but he's got himself into a bit of a hole, and that was very much reflected in PMQs today. This should have been a hands-down win for Keir Starmer. Labour won those 2 by-elections last week in completely unprecedented territory, and yet it very much felt as though Keir Starmer was on the back foot the whole time. Rishi Sunak was asked by the SNP whether the Prime Minister, the government, commits to a ceasefire in the Middle East, and it felt a little bit as though that question was really aimed at Keir Starmer.
And just to reiterate, I think Angela Rayner will be with him. So is she going to hold his coat, or how's the dynamic going to play out?
Well, it'll be really interesting to find out, because reading between the lines, it sounds as though Angela Rayner, she hasn't come out and said anything, obviously, but reading between the lines, it sounds as though she is a little bit unsure about Keir Starmer's uncompromising line on Israel. We know the two of them don't get on that well. They managed to sort of hold together their relationship in public, but there's a lot of tension there. And it could be that Angela Rayner has the support of lots of MPs in her party, and as you say, will be holding Keir Starmer's coat.
Olivia, thank you for that, and we'll be updating people on the outcome of that meeting. Thanks very much indeed.
Well, heavy and persistent rain has been causing travel and business disruption along the south coast of England. We're going to be getting an update from the Isle of Wight, which has really been suffering some heavy flooding, as you can see from those images. First, let's get your latest headlines with Ray Addison.
Thank you both. 32 minutes past 1, our top stories. The first load of humanitarian aid from the UK to Gaza is on its way to Egypt. We can see live footage now from Gaza. Well, the Ministry of Defence confirmed an RAF plane is carrying 21 tonnes of supplies, which include medical equipment and water filters. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister is refusing to support calls for a ceasefire, despite pressure from more than 80 MPs to do so. Instead, Rishi Sunak is backing specific pauses, quote, in the conflict to allow for a safe delivery of aid to the territory. Well, meanwhile, Israel intensified airstrikes on the territory overnight, the military saying that it targeted Hamas infrastructure, including a weapons warehouse. The Palestinian Health Ministry, which is run by Hamas, says 756 people, including 344 children, have been killed in the past 24 hours. It brings the total to more than 6,500 since the 7th of October. The Israel Defense Forces also say the Navy spotted terrorists exiting a tunnel onto a beach on the Strip. They were killed when they tried to enter Israeli territory by sea. Back here, a former South Wales police officer has been jailed for life with a minimum of 12 years for sexual offences against children. Lewis Edwards used fake social media accounts and posed as a teenager to groom more than 200 young girls online. He forced his victims to take indecent videos and images of themselves, using the material to blackmail them. 2 Metropolitan Police officers have been found guilty of gross misconduct over the stop and search of 2 black athletes. Ricardo dos Santos and his partner Bianca Williams were stopped in their car in London back in 2020. Nothing was found and no arrests were made, with the pair publicly accusing the force of racism. 5 officers were investigated, all of them denied any wrongdoing. The panel found that both PC Jonathan Clapham and PC Sam Franks were guilty. You can get more on all those stories on our website, gbnews.com.
For a valuable legacy your family can own, gold coins will always shine bright. Rosalind Gold proudly sponsors the GB News Financial Report.
Back to Pip and Mark in a moment, but first a quick snapshot of the markets. The pound will buy you $1.2123 and €1.1462. Price of gold, £1,630 and 3 pence per ounce, and the FTSE 100's at 7,412 points.
Rosalind Gold proudly sponsors the GB News Financial Report.
In a world of dull and predictable radio and TV shows.
Oh, hi. On Mark Dolan tonight, we've got big guests. We drill into the big stories of the day. The show adds up to a brilliant listening and viewing experience. Mark Dolan Tonight is the most entertaining current affairs show ever, and that's a fact. Join me, Mark Dolan, Fridays and Saturdays from 9, Sundays from 10. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
There's only 3 people you can trust in life: your doctor, your lawyer, and your nana.
I'm not sure.
So join me, Nana Aquare, at 3 p.m. every Saturday and Sunday, where we discuss the biggest topics of the weekend. Be ready for battle. Could you be quiet? What is this?
It's my new teeth.
It's your new teeth. I don't bite. Well, not without a good reason. Always honest, always fun. Every weekend at 3 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Kerr, we tackle the issues of the day with real, robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute. Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christys, at drive time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app, and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christys, on GB News and GB News Radio.
Welcome back to the live desk. We're going to keep you updated on the situation with the flooding, particularly in the Isle of Wight, really badly hit. But should we cheer ourselves up with something from Buckingham Palace? Because we've got a picture coming in of a Diamond Day.
Colleague Anne Diamond has received her OBE at Buckingham Palace, an OBE for her services to public health and charity, including all that campaigning that she's done for research into cot death.
Yeah, and of course that's very close to her heart. But she could have dressed up for the day, couldn't she? Really? Oh,
didn't she look terrible? Scruffy so-and-so.
Anyway, congratulations. Does that mean that, you know, every morning now it has to be Anne Diamond OBE on the screen? So congratulations.
Fabulous picture, yeah.
Yeah, a lifetime's work, effectively, in terms of that charitable cause. Now, as we were saying, parts of the UK left devastated by floods, Storm Babbitt battering the country over the past few days, and the north particularly hit, but now it's the south that's got a walloping.
Yeah, and communities are hitting out at the lack of help to save their homes from the downpours. Our reporter, Anna Riley, has been out talking to flood victims in Rotherham and can join us now. Good afternoon, Anna. What stories have they been telling you about all this?
Good afternoon. Well, there's still a lot of shock, a lot of upset as the aftermath of the storm continues, the clean-up effort continues. Behind me, people's possessions are still laid outside, ready for the council to collect them. And the upset that there is in this community is that they were hit hard by flooding back in 2007, 16 years ago, and they were told that flood defences had been put in place, that £15 million had been spent, and flooding of this level wouldn't happen again. But it has, and now that's left this community yet again decimated, water levels rising above 6 metres, completely destroying the ground floor of homes. It was 250 houses that were evacuated on Saturday when the River Rother burst its banks as a result of heavy rain. And then obviously there was a wait then for the river to come down before the water could be pumped. Now it's not heavy rain like it was yesterday. The sun is out, so there's no water anymore, but people here in the community have been telling me it's going to take them up to 12 months before they can move back into their homes. Some people also don't have insurance as well to cover the repairs to their homes, and there's concern as well about selling their property if that's going to be possible at all with this risk of flooding happening again. So people here are looking for answers, and they're looking for assurances that flooding of this level won't happen again.
Yeah, and this does seem to be a feature, Anna, that those people who have been hit by flooding before then find that the insurance companies are not paying out or saying that their policies are null and void.
Yeah, that's right, Mark. And last time some people's homes were valued at £1 as well. So it's finding that mortgage broker. I can see that at one home behind me here, it says it's got a sold sign on it, but we don't know if that sale will now go through. And it's as well, if people have got insurance, that'll cover possessions like televisions, sofas, but there's been very emotional, sentimental items that have been lost in this flood as well that just cannot be replaced. So people here are saying they don't know if they want to live in this community anymore, if it's going to keep being flood hit.
Anna, thank you for that. And of course, as you say, many families assessing the loss of not just valuable items, but things that really are important to them.
It is the south coast now that has been affected in the last few hours by all this heavy and persistent rain, and the Isle of Wight recorded as the worst hit area after more than 2 inches of rain fell in 6 hours.
And of course, falling on already soaked ground. Well, let's speak now to Victoria Dunford, who runs a charity there. Victoria, thank you very much indeed for your time. And Bob Seeley, the local MP, was with us for PMQ, saying what a marvellous job you've been doing down there, but I think you've literally been washed out down there, the pictures we were seeing earlier.
Yes, it happens first time to us. We've been in East Coast for last 11 years. First time I witnessed flooding like this. We came normal to work this morning, but we couldn't work because there was no electricity, and we had 6 inches of rain inside our community room.
So what's it done to you there?
It stopped all the events for this week. Obviously, we are a charity. We run on fundraising events. The community room is been rented out today and tomorrow, and we have our own event on Friday, but those has to be cancelled. So
we're just looking at some images now. I mean, that looks like even more than 2 inches. And also on the Isle of Wight, there's been travel problems as well, hasn't there?
It has been a travel problems. A lot of people have problems, like they open the door and the water was just coming out from inside. All the community got together and they clear out. We are clearing out pretty much all our street. Our room downstairs, we took the water out. However, all the furniture and everything else is still soaking wet.
Did you have any idea, Victoria, did you have any idea that this was coming? Or was it a complete surprise?
Was a complete surprise. We had a yellow warning yesterday, but we had these yellow warnings last year, and we never had flooded like this caliber.
Yeah, I think it's just the amount that fell in such a short time, isn't it? And the ground already soaked. But what does it mean now for your charitable work there? Have you managed to move some of your equipment and supplies to safety, or are you going to have to start from scratch again?
Well, we have managed to save most of our equipment. Likely our offices are upstairs, so downstairs we have a community room we are renting for events, for the for our community, for different clubs. So the downstairs, we are still can assess full damage. We took the water out, however, the water still comes under the flooring, so we don't know if we'll have to replace the flooring or not. All the walls are soaking wet. We trying to collect as many dehumidifiers as possible at the moment, but we cannot assess the full damage just yet. However, our equipment is safe, thanks, because our office is upstairs.
OK, but perhaps, again, the problems with the insurance company as well as in terms of getting all that damage repaired. But we wish you well. Thanks for updating us, and we'll speak to you again soon, hopefully, when maybe you can get back on your feet. Victoria Dunford there with that charity in the Isle of Wight, the latest area to get hit with the floods.
Now, there is plenty of anger in, in London and all over the country after it was revealed that barriers have been placed around the Cenotaph on Whitehall. Now, that is the UK's foremost war memorial, and it's amid concerns that the monument could be damaged in protests ahead of Remembrance Sunday.
Which, of course, is not that far away, and it is the centrepiece of that day, Remembrance. Let's get more of the London reporter, Lisa Hartle, who's actually there for us now. What do they actually put round it, Lisa?
Sorry, just as you were speaking there, a vehicle went by. There's, as you can see behind me, hopefully, there's fences around the Cenotaph. Now, we've seen the Cenotaph boarded up many times when there are protests that are taking place. And I spoke to some police officers on the street here earlier and asked them, and they said that that's indeed the case. Whenever we have a protest, they said we want to ensure that the Cenotaph is protected. At the weekend, there was outrage when a protest took place, but there was a stage erected next to the Cenotaph. Now, of course, the Cenotaph is a focal point for so many people that wish to go there and to pay their respects to those that have been lost in conflict. It's over 100 years old. The first Cenotaph was actually put in place as a wooden structure, a temporary structure after the First World War, for people to go and pay their respects to those that they'd lost. But then this permanent structure that we now have today has remained in place all this time, and it serves as a place for veterans to go and to pay their respects to their fallen comrades, for family members, for friends to go and pay their respects to loved ones that they've lost in conflict. Now, Johnny Mercer, the Veterans Minister, who's a veteran himself, has said that he understands the hurt caused by having a stage close to the Cenotaph. And he said that this was on X, formerly known as Twitter, spoke to the Home Secretary and met police on how to avoid this happening again. And the police have said that with further protests planned, they're guaranteeing that the stage will not be anywhere near the Cenotaph going forward. Going forward from this, there is growing concern throughout the UK and in other countries around security and just everyone just feeling a little bit on edge. We've heard from Kensington Palace. They've said that they are not going to have their annual ice rink this Christmas. That's amidst heightened security concerns with the conflict going on. And then in France, it was announced that the Europe MTV Awards, the video awards there, that's not going to take place. And they cited the same reasons.
Yeah, but just to talk about the Cenotaph in particular, we think that this is not a specific warning about it being targeted. This is just a precautionary measure because of the number of protests expected.
Yeah, exactly. So that's where I spoke to a police officer here, and he just reiterated the fact. I mean, we've seen it many times with protests. Sometimes you see the boards around the Cenotaph. This time it's just the fences that you can see. On New Year's Eve, they'll board up places like the Cenotaph and other important structures and memorials around London as a preventative measure. And as you said in the link into me there, this is ahead of the special occasion coming up, the Remembrance Day coming up in November. So it's a precautionary measure ahead of any protests taking place.
Lisa at the Cenotaph, thanks very much for updating us there.
Global debt is at a tipping point. That's according to the boss of HSBC Bank, Noel Quinn.
You're speaking at a financial summit in Saudi Arabia, known as the Davos in the desert. Of course, Davos, the Swiss, get together in the winter. Well, Quinn's alert following last month's warnings from the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and the World Bank that debt across the world was now becoming unsustainable. Let's get more with our economics and business editor, Liam Halligan, with On the Money.
Is he right, Liam, to make that warning?
Maxed out. I think it's interesting that the guy that runs the 7th biggest bank in the world is saying things that up until now, journalistic scribblers like me have been saying. There is an awful lot of concern out there, Mark and Pip, that since 2008, and particularly since the COVID lockdown, a lot of governments around the world have been amassing debt at a huge scale. The UK, the US in particular. Debt in China is very, very high. Debt in Italy is very, very high. And does that mean we're approaching some kind of reckoning on financial markets? We're already seeing bond yields, that is the price that governments must pay to borrow. They're rocketing up. They're at a 25-year high in the US. They're almost at a 30-year high here in the UK. Let's have a look at what Noel Quinn actually said. He said to a sort of ritzy summit, as you say, in Saudi Arabia, I'm concerned about a tipping point on fiscal deficits. That is, government spending more than they collect in tax revenue. When it comes, it will come fast, and I think there are a number of economies in the world where that could be a tipping point, and it will hit hard. Interestingly, he talked about the US, where Joe Biden is massing lots and lots of debt, and he talked about the UK as well. Let's have a quick look at UK debt levels. This is government debt. You can see a graph here. We've gone up from, here we go, from the year 2000, it's at 30% of GDP, 30% the size of the economy. Through the financial crisis 2008, we're now up at almost 100% of GDP, with an increase since the COVID-19 pandemic and lockdown there starting in 2020, and then again, Russia and Ukraine. In Italy, debt's gone up from 120% of GDP in 2012 when there was the Eurozone crisis, all the way up to 140% of GDP now. In China, the numbers are opaque, but we think debt there is about 140% of GDP. And what this means is that financial markets, investors demand more and more and more return to lend money to the government, and that knocks on interest rates for us. If we've got personal loans, mortgages, car purchase, hire purchase, whatever it is. That's why bond markets, which sound arcane, are really, really important. You may not be interested in bond markets, Pip, but they're interested in you. And what happens when we hit that tipping point? What is the tipping point? What happens when the circuit breakers blow? A tipping point, Mark, is when something like we had in 2008. Again, I'm a financial journalist. I've got to be responsible trying to, predict market meltdowns. But I'm just reporting what Noel Quinn said, who runs HSBC, which, as I said, is the 7th biggest bank in the world. And it wasn't just him. It was, other titans of Wall Street and the City of London at this conference were piling in as well. And the tipping point means that financial markets, suddenly they demand a lot more for the government to borrow. Governments then have trouble providing public services. Governments then have to put up debt. That slows down growth, and you get into a even higher debt, downward high interest spiral, rate, low growth spiral. Financial markets see that coming, shares fall, and you get a kind of 2008 style meltdown.
And what's happening at the moment, the Israel-Hamas war, that could impact on all this as well?
I often feel rather self-conscious, Pip, when I have these discussions with you and Mark, and obviously we're seeing ghastly pictures out of Gaza, ghastly pictures out of Israel in general, all kinds of loss of life. It seems almost ridiculous to talk about money, but in the end, war has knock-on effects on living standards around the world, particularly when it leads to financial markets becoming very turbulent, whether it's through the oil price. Of course, the oil price is knocking up now above $90 a barrel, whether it's through government spending money on war, or whether it's just basic, diplomatic meltdowns and turbulence which spook investors around the world. There seems to me, we were meant to be in the middle of a sort of post-COVID bounce back at the moment, weren't we? We were meant to be in the sunlit uplands. But it does seem to me... I remember well, yeah. It does, and towards the end of this year, interest rates were going to come down, inflation was going to come down. It does seem to me there's a sort of confluence of bad news, storm clouds on the horizon. But, fingers crossed, we live in hope. Liam, thank you for that. Let's just update you on the latest. Rishi Sunak releasing this news of a Ministry of Defence RAF plane. This is it being loaded with humanitarian aid heading to Gaza. 21 tonnes. Well, there we are. They're even helping us with the facts and figures there on the screen.
Yeah, and Rishi Sunak spoke about this a little earlier in the House of Commons, and he said that there was medical kits, 75,000 medical kits, solar lights, water filters, and the UK government, he says, is doing everything it can to get that humanitarian aid in to support Palestinian civilians, as the UN warns that the fuel could run out in Gaza tonight.
Yeah, the latest that we're getting from the hospitals is that they are effectively on emergency generators, saying they desperately need fuel. The UN saying that its aid operation may have to cease by tonight. We'll have the latest from one of those doctors on the front line as that C-17 Globemaster takes off. All the latest for you here on the live desk on GB News. Stay with us.
Who is it? We're here for the show.
More energy this time!
Welcome to the dinosaur hour. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie.
Second best.
You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with these three.
Oh! No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sundays at 9 on GB News.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News.
Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute. Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's, at drive time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christie's, on GB News and GB News Radio.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train.
Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa! Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Good afternoon, it is 2 o'clock and this is the live desk here on GB News. Coming up this Wednesday afternoon,
Now, the diplomatic battle in the Middle East. Israel calling for the UN Secretary-General to resign after he said Palestinians have been subjected to 56 years of suffocating occupation.
New fears that the conflict could escalate. Pictures released by the Israelis show Hamas attacks from the sea, suggesting that it has significant firepower. Our security editor Mark White has the latest from Tel Aviv.
At PMQs, Rishi Sunak faces Sir Keir Starmer for the first time since the by-election defeats, clashing over housing, the cost of living crisis, but appearing to be united over their support for Israel.
A police officer who blackmailed and threatened underage girls to send him explicit photos of themselves on Snapchat is jailed for life. We'll be live with the latest from Cardiff Crown Court.
And yet more rain, yet more floods, this time hitting the south. The Isle of Wight has extensive damage to homes and roads and businesses, and the weather warnings remaining in place for other parts too. We'll update you on that. But first, the headlines with Ray.
Thank you both. Good afternoon. It is 1 minute past 2, our top stories. The first load of humanitarian aid from the UK to Gaza is now on its way to Egypt. The Ministry of Defence confirmed that an RAF plane is carrying 21 tonnes of supplies, which includes medical equipment and water filters. The government says stockpiles of wound care packs were donated by the Department for Health. The aid will be distributed through the Egyptian Red Crescent. We can see live pictures now from Gaza for those watching on television. Meanwhile, here the UK Prime Minister is refusing to support calls for a ceasefire, despite pressure from more than 80 MPs to do so. Instead, Rishi Sunak is backing what he calls specific pauses in the conflict to allow for a safe delivery of aid to the territory. 5 British nationals were among more than 200 people still being held hostage in Gaza.
The most important principle is that Israel has the right to defend itself under international law. Our support for that position is absolute and unchanged. But from the start, we have also said that we do want British nationals to be able to leave Gaza, and that we want hostages to be released and for humanitarian aid to get in. And we recognise that for all of that to happen, there has to be a safer environment, which of course necessitates specific pauses as distinct from a ceasefire.
As we've been hearing, Israel intensified its airstrikes on Gaza overnight. The military says it targeted Hamas infrastructure, including a weapons warehouse. The Palestinian Health Ministry, which is run by Hamas, says 756 people, including 344 children, have been killed in the past 24 hours. It brings the total to more than 6,500 since October the 7th. The Israel Defense Forces also saying that the Navy spotted terrorists exiting a tunnel onto a beach on the Strip. They were killed when they tried to enter Israeli territory by sea. A former South Wales police officer has been jailed for life with a minimum of 12 years for sexual offences against children. Lewis Edwards used fake social media accounts and posed as a teenager to groom more than 200 young girls online. He forced his victims to take indecent videos and images of themselves, using the material to blackmail them. In sentencing, the judge described his behaviour as cruel and sadistic and said he posed a dangerous risk to children. 2 Met police officers have been found guilty of gross misconduct over the stop and search of 2 black athletes. Ricardo dos Santos and his partner Bianca Williams were stopped in their car in London, in 2020. Nothing was found, no arrests were made. The pair publicly accused the force of racism. 5 officers were investigated. All of them denied any wrongdoing, but the panel upheld complaints against PC's Jonathan Clapham and Sam Franks. 3 people have been arrested on suspicion of criminal damage after Just Stop Oil activists sprayed London's Wellington Arch orange. The group posted footage online as they demanded the government end new oil and gas. The video shows activists covering the almost 200-year-old Grade 1 listed structure with paint before setting off orange flares. Rishi Sunak has been quizzed on the cost of living crisis during Prime Minister's questions earlier on his first anniversary as Tory leader. The Labour leader accused the Conservatives of crashing the economy, raising the case of one family whose mortgage went up by a quarter. Rishi Sunak responded by saying his government's policy to cope with rising interest rates is twice as generous as Labour's would be, and that the opposition has a track record of U-turns. However, Sir Keir says the British public continues to be abandoned by this government.
Truth is, his candidate in Tamworth summed up perfectly just how his and his Tories are treating the British public. So will he just call a general election and give the British public the chance to respond, as they did in Selby, Mid-Beds and Tamworth? They've heard the government telling them to F off, and they want the chance to return the compliment.
As we saw with his recent decisions on actually building new houses, politicians like him always take the easy way out, Mr. Speaker, whereas we're getting on making the right long-term decisions to change this country for the better on net zero, on HS2, on a smoke-free generation, on education and energy security. Contrast that to his leadership, too cautious to say anything and hope that nobody notices, Mr. Speaker. Let me tell him, come that general election, the British people will.
And finally, Anne Diamond has been made an OBE at Buckingham Palace. The journalist and GB News presenter received the honour from King Charles for her services to public health and charity. It recognised her campaigning efforts for research into cot death following the death of her son Sebastian from sudden infant death syndrome. She said in June that she received news of the honour on the same day that she was diagnosed with breast cancer. This is GB News across the UK on TV, in your car, on digital radio and on your smart speaker by saying, play GB News. Now let's get back to Mark and Pip.
Ray, thank you very much indeed. Welcome back to the live desk. Now, we saw that humanitarian aid on its way with that MOD flight, that C-17 Globemaster, but an extraordinary intervention now from Oxfam, the aid charity, which has warned of starvation being used, quote, as a weapon of war against civilians in Gaza, renewing its calls for more food and water supplies to be delivered and fuel to be allowed to enter the Gaza Strip.
And Israel is continuing to demand the resignation of UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, saying he is no longer fit to lead it after he linked Hamas's attack to what he called Israel's 56 years of suffocating occupation of Palestine. Also just hearing now that Israel has denied a visa to top UN official Martin Griffiths after the UN Secretary-General's comments.
Well, meanwhile, fears that Gaza's hospitals could be on the brink of cancelling all but life-saving treatments due to a shortage of fuel and equipment. The UN saying that it has just 24 hours of fuel left and it may have to end its aid operations tonight. Then, on the military front, Israel appearing to say that its calls for a ceasefire from the UN are not acceptable, intensifying strikes indeed against Hamas, seeking to destroy the terror group's military capabilities.
GB News' security editor Mark White has sent us this report from Tel Aviv.
Just hours after the UN Secretary-General called for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza, this was Israel's response. A further intensification of airstrikes against what Israel says were Hamas positions, including command and control compounds, ammunition stores and rocket launchers. But with many of those Hamas positions right in the centre of residential areas, the toll on Gaza's civilians is enormous. The Hamas-controlled health ministry claimed more than 700 died in the latest round of Israeli strikes. Dismissing the Secretary-General's call for a ceasefire, Israel said it had no intention of easing up on its operation to destroy Hamas. And there is now widespread anger across Israel after Antonio Guterres went on to say that although there was no justification for the attacks on the 7th of October, They did not occur, he said, in a vacuum.
The Palestinian people have been subjected to 56 years of suffocating occupation. They have seen their land steadily devoured by settlements and plagued by violence, their economy stifled, their people displaced, and their homes demolished.
I think that the Secretary General must resign, because from now on, every day that he is here in this building, unless he apologizes immediately, today we called him to apologize, there's no justification to the existence of this building.
There are growing fears here of a widening regional conflict. The head of the Hezbollah terror group in Lebanon has met leaders from Hamas and Islamic Jihad, pledging support for a resistance axis against Israel, which would include help from Iran and Syria. These unverified images claim to show the aftermath of an Israeli strike on Syrian military positions overnight, which the IDF said had been launching rockets into Israel. Syrian authorities say 8 of their soldiers were killed and 7 injured. And in another serious incident, Israel said it killed a group of Hamas terrorists trying to reach Israel by sea to launch an attack in a community north of Gaza. It came on the back of the largest rocket barrage into central Israel since the 7th of October attacks. Across Tel Aviv, people ran for shelters as Iron Dome missile defense systems intercepted multiple Hamas rockets. One struck a community northeast of Tel Aviv, badly damaging a property. With many more burials in Israel and in Gaza, any thoughts of a ceasefire in this conflict must seem a very long way off. Mark White, GB News, Tel Aviv.
Mark White is in Tel Aviv still for us, and we can get the latest from him now. Mark, let's start with what Oxfam is saying, that starvation is being used as a weapon by Israel against Gaza civilians. There is a real division now between what aid agencies are saying, Oxford and the UN, and what Israel is saying, which is that there is a false picture being created here by Hamas about the situation on the ground.
Yes, I mean, Israel says that Hamas has had years to prepare for what is coming now, that they have got hundreds of thousands of litres of fuel stored underground that they could give to hospitals, and indeed are giving to hospitals, because we heard 10 days or so ago that there was 24 hours of fuel left for hospitals to run their generators, yet, according to Israel, those generators have been running ever since. I think the situation on the ground is much more complicated and precarious than that, though we know there are images and reports coming out from colleagues in Gaza that these hospitals are running very low on their fuel supplies, that they are powering down those generators, they're cancelling a lot of operations, and they are only firing up their generators to actually carry out very significant operations to save lives. There are pictures of ambulances arriving at hospitals late at night with doctors and medical staff using their phones, the lights on their phones, to shine the way for those stretchers to come into the hospital. So there's no doubt there are very significant problems.
Yeah.
I think most Western countries would acknowledge that. We heard Rishi Sunak, the British Prime Minister, saying today, or at least his spokesman indicating that they may well push for some kind of a pause, not a ceasefire, but a humanitarian pause to allow more trucks in.
Now, the issue is that Oxfam's being quite specific, asserting that starvation is being used as a weapon of war. Their regional Middle East director saying the situation becoming nothing short of horrific. Now, we've got this RAF plane on the way with 21 tons of aid, but as we've been reporting daily, the problem is, of course, trying to get it across the border physically into Gaza.
Yes, because there are very few trucks coming across that border into Gaza. 62 trucks have made it since Gaza was effectively closed off on that border. The Rafah crossing into Egypt was closed at the start of this war. Now, Oxfam is saying that really that's only 2% of the food supplies that would normally get into Gaza have gone into Gaza, and there needs clearly to be far more in the way of aid and food supplies and water supplies and fuel, they say. Well, Israel is not at this stage anyway going to countenance any fuel trucks going in, but may be open depending on what the US, UK and other Western allies say to them. They may be willing to look at the possibility of a pause to allow more aid trucks in, or at least try and facilitate that themselves. It's complicated though, because they say that sites around the Rafah crossing, all around both north and southern Gaza, are being used by the Hamas terrorists to pop up from tunnels, to launch missile strikes or rocket strikes into Israel on almost an hourly basis. The alerts go off. They respond, of course, when these launchers pop up with immediate airstrikes back. So nothing is safe in these areas. We know that the strikes are not just confined to the north, but they are taking place in the south as well and around that Rafah crossing area.
And of course, the issue being that, yet more calls for a ceasefire. It happened again at PMQs today in the Commons. But of course, the Israelis pointing out that Hamas still has military capability. They launched this maritime strike on a beach with these extraordinary pictures of this sort of specialist frogman unit.
Yes, well, in a way, it's quite worrying, I suppose, for Israel that they have been pounding Hamas positions, they say, for more than 2 weeks now, with very significant firepower from the air. But despite that, we had the largest rocket barrage hitting central Israel, or at least targeting central Israel, since this conflict began on the 7th of October, with people running for the shelters, one rocket getting through to a community northeast of Tel Aviv. The fact that they still have the capability to launch hundreds of rockets off towards Israel on a daily basis is clearly of concern to the Israelis. And then add to that the fact that, according to the IDF, you had these Hamas terrorists exiting that tunnel, getting into their scuba gear and trying to head towards southern Israel over or under the Mediterranean, but they were taken out by the Israeli Navy and by air forces as well. So clearly there's still capability, there's still a determination by Hamas to do that. So given that, it might mean that there is even more of a case, the IDF might argue, for going in on the ground, because there's only so much they can do in the way of an aerial attack. It's clearly not doing exactly what they want to do in degrading Hamas's capabilities.
Regarding the 200-plus hostages, Mark, we've been hearing from Qatar today, who are sounding quite optimistic, saying there will be a breakthrough, they hope, in the hostage releases very soon. It sounds like there are further negotiations and talks happening there.
Yes, I mean, the Qataris have been saying this for over a week now. They have been involved in negotiations. They are actually calling for a ceasefire while these negotiations continue. Their argument is that if they gain the release of hostages, it is much more difficult to have these hostages taken to a place of safety to be handed over if there is a ground war in place, and if, of course, Gaza is continuing to be struck regularly by the Israeli military. But certainly in terms of the air war, that's not going, as far as Israel is concerned, to cease anytime soon. They are rather suspicious of Qatar, to say the very least. They have accused Qatar of being a sponsor of Hamas anyway. Of course, they do allow offices for Hamas in Qatar as well. So Israel would say they're not really an honest broker in this conflict, although, of course, any moves to try and release the hostages has got to be welcome.
Mark in Tel Aviv, thank you for updating us there with the latest. More from you, of course, throughout the afternoon as the situation changes. Well, coming up, the continuing riot over housing those asylum seekers in hotels. Why local councils now say they'll still be there and they'll be picking up the bill. Latest details coming up.
In a world of dull and predictable radio and TV shows.
Oh, hi. On Mark Dolan tonight, we've got big guests. We drill into the big stories of the day. The show adds up to a brilliant listening and viewing experience. Mark Dolan Tonight is the most entertaining current affairs show ever, and that's a fact. Join me, Mark Dolan, Fridays and Saturdays from 9, Sundays from 10. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
There's only 3 people you can trust in life. Your doctor, your lawyer, and your nana.
I'm not sure.
So join me, Nana Aquare, at 3 p.m. every Saturday and Sunday, where we discuss the biggest topics of the weekend. Be ready for battle. Could you be quiet? What is this?
It's my new teeth.
Your new teeth. I don't bite. Well, not without a good reason. Always honest, always fun. Every weekend at 3 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes & Co, we tackle the issues of the day with real, robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute. Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christys, at drive time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app, and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christys, on GB News and GB News Radio.
Welcome back to the live desk. We're just getting news of more explosions in Gaza coming through. It has been fairly quiet so far today, but these are the latest shots. Now, that is a significant explosion there on the skyline, where, of course, we've had these calls for a ceasefire, but certainly Israel was indicating that there's been rocket fire from Hamas into central Israel, Tel Aviv, and then this maritime incursion onto a beach just north of the Gaza Strip, with Israel saying it had to fight off effectively a commando raid by Hamas frogmen wearing scuba suits.
And while you are looking at those images, there are warnings that hospitals are stopping all but emergency services because the fuel is running out. And indeed, Oxfam is saying that starvation is being used as a weapon of war against Gazan civilians.
But what we're looking at here is a huge plume of smoke there over the skyline of Gaza City. We'll try and get details for you as to what's happened, where this strike has been and what the aftermath of ramifications are. But, of course, let's just reflect that it is very much an active political question here at home. Sir Keir Starmer meeting Labour Muslim MPs at the moment, continuing his efforts to, well, there's been a backlash over his position on Israel and Gaza, in particular his comments on Israel having the right to cut off power and water from Gaza. Let's get more with our political editor, Christopher Hope. Chris, I think you had Angela Rayner with him to hold his coat as well.
That's right. It's a big meeting there with Muslim MPs and peers. It goes back to the 11th of October when Keir Starmer said in an interview with LBC that Israel was right to withhold water and power and from Gaza as they try and deal with the hostage crisis out there. Fast forward more 2 weeks since then, there's real anger and fury amongst Muslim supporters of the Labour Party. Some councillors have quit, and Keir Starmer's trying to keep a lid on this by meeting with these individuals this lunchtime and trying to control this escalating problem he's got with authority. He has won a lot of plaudits, I think, Keir Starmer, for the way he has held Labour's support together for Israel. Certainly in that party conference, the battle over what to do about this crisis was outside the conference hall, not inside it, as it might have been under Jeremy Corbyn. So that meeting's ongoing now, and I think that is the first wrinkle, that's the first area where the Tories can show they are behind Israel on this whole area defending itself, and Labour is slightly wobbly at the top. That's the problem they've got.
Yeah, because at Prime Minister's questions today, there was the front bencher, wasn't there, Yasmin Qureshi, who used PMQs to call the situation in Gaza collective punishment.
That's right, and this kind of language is what is so difficult for Sir Keir Starmer. He's trying to say that Labour has the right to defend itself against the attacks by Hamas, but equally there's also the 2.2 million people in Gaza, and with a huge, as you're hearing now in the news there, a huge humanitarian disaster unfolding there, and that's the balance he's got to strike, supporting Israel's right to defend itself, but also thinking about the victims, the civilian victims of any action within Gaza, and that's the problem he's facing, trying to hold that together. So far, it's gone okay for the Labour leadership, but it's starting to be tested, I think, with these resignations of Labour councillors over this position. Right, and in the House today, it was ignored by Sir Keir Starmer. He talked more about the Labour wins last week in the by-elections, but nothing further to that.
Chris, thank you for that. And, of course, those calls for a ceasefire in that PMQ session. But let's just take you back to the skyline in Gaza. A second explosion in the past few minutes there to the right of your picture. So no indication of any ceasefire at the moment. What appears to be more airstrikes on the Gaza Strip. And as we were reporting, the UN saying that the humanitarian situation is becoming almost untenable, and Oxfam adding its weight to the argument that the humanitarian situation is becoming too difficult for them to deal with. Indications that they believe starvation being used as a weapon of war. No response or riposte from the Israeli side at the moment, but of course we'll keep you updated on this. But there's more smoke there in the distance. I think this is the impact. We can bring you some pictures of when this hit. And that, again, was a huge explosion. And certainly the Palestinian health authorities, which are controlled by Hamas, say that the number of dead and injured continues to grow with the damage being caused to various buildings as a result of these strikes.
They are claiming, Hamas-run health ministry is saying that 6,546 Palestinians have been killed in the Gaza Strip by Israeli airstrikes since the 7th of October, and that includes 2,704 children. But, of course, it is impossible at the moment to verify their claims independently.
Yeah, as we get more details on what's happening in terms of the explosions and where they've been hitting, we'll update you on the details. But let's reflect on events here now with, well, the details coming up you might find distressing, because a former South Wales police officer, Lewis Edwards, has been jailed for life at Cardiff Crown Court with a minimum of 12 years for sexual offences that he carried out against more than 200 children.
He used fake social media accounts posing as a teenager to groom and blackmail more than 200 young girls online using social media platform Snapchat. Well, let's cross live to Cardiff Crown Court, where we are joined by GB News reporter Jack Carson. Jack, some of this detail is very graphic, isn't it? What on earth did the court hear here?
Yeah, so this has been a three-day sentencing. It started on Monday. For all 3 days, Edwards refused to appear in front of the court. But over the past 3 days, we have heard how Edwards incited 210 girls aged between 10 and 16 into sending him images of them performing sexual acts on themselves, the detail of which, particularly around the instruction, the explicit instruction he would get them to do in terms of the videos these girls were sending him, in terms of the pictures these girls were sending them, is horrific. He masqueraded himself often as pretending to be people that these girls knew, pretending to be people of a similar age. In one instance, he pretended with one girl that he was a 14-year-old boy, and then he secretly recorded the explicit images and videos these girls were sending them, using that then to blackmail them when they became scared, when they became terrified of what he was doing to them. Sentencing Mr. Edwards today, Judge Tracy Lloyd said that the defendant had a pattern of behaviour. She said he groomed his victims, psychologically manipulating them until he had gained control over them. She added that even when his victims were crying, distressed, begging him to stop, even in some cases, as this court heard this week, when victims admitted to him that they were self-harming or suicidal, he said the judge said that the defendant did not stop. But speaking to me and to GB News, Detective Superintendent Tracy Rankin detailed the sophistication that Edwards had with his devices where he stored these images.
You or I might have an iPad or a laptop with our, family photographs on there saved under folder names. There were devices there, so mobile phones, there were laptops and other computers, there were separate hard drives as well. But the way that everything was networked at the scene it wasn't as simple as just unplugging everything and taking away to our labs for examination, because there was a degree of sophistication and encryption that if you did that, it would have wiped everything. So we would have lost the evidence that we were seeking. So, the specialists and the experts from our digital forensics unit, they built the appropriate software and technology in order to download everything in situ so that we wouldn't lose any evidence. There was file directories where they had numbers next to the folders, which was indicative of ages that would suggest that the contents of those folders would include imagery of that age parameter as well. So there was a degree of organisation and filing of those images and videos as well.
And of course, as well as that sentence this week, this court also heard examples of the impact of his crimes. One mother told the court that he took away her daughter's innocence and it felt like she was living in a nightmare.
Jack at Cardiff Crown Court, thank you very much indeed for updating us, as we say, with some upsetting details, of course, in that report. We'll keep you updated on what's going on in Gaza City. More explosions, as we say, in these past few minutes. Huge plumes of smoke. We'll try to establish what they've hit and where. All the details coming up. First, the headlines with Ray.
Thank you both. Good afternoon. It's 2:33, our top stories. The first load of humanitarian aid from the UK to Gaza is on its way to Egypt. The Ministry of Defence confirmed that an RAF plane is carrying 21 tonnes of supplies, which includes medical equipment and water filters. The aid will be distributed through the Egyptian Red Crescent. We can see live pictures now of Gaza where that explosion recently took place. There's still black smoke rising up into the sky, hundreds of metres. But meanwhile here, the Prime Minister is refusing to support calls for a ceasefire, despite pressure from more than 80 MPs to do so. Instead, Rishi Sunak is backing what he calls specific pauses in the conflict to allow for the safe delivery of aid to the territory. 5 British nationals were among more than 200 people still being held hostage in Gaza. A former South Wales police officer, as we've been hearing, has been jailed for life with a minimum of 12 years for sexual offences against children. Lewis Edwards used fake social media accounts and posed as a teenager to groom more than 200 young girls online. He forced his victims to take indecent videos and images of themselves, using the material to blackmail them. 2 Metropolitan Police officers have been found guilty of gross misconduct over the stop and search of 2 black athletes. Ricardo dos Santos and his partner Bianca Williams were stopped in their car in London in 2020. Nothing was found, no arrests were made, and the pair publicly accused the force of racism. 5 officers were investigated, all denied any wrongdoing, but the panel upheld complaints against PC Jonathan Clapham and Sam Franks. You'll find more on all of those stories on our website, gbnews.com.
Who is it? We're here for the show.
More energy this time!
Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie.
Second best.
You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with these 3.
Ah!
No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sundays at 9 on GB News.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News.
Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute. Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's, at drive time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christie's, on GB News and GB News Radio.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train.
Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa! Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Welcome back to the live desk. Let's take you live back to Gaza, where we've seen these huge explosions in these past few minutes. You can see the aftermath, the black smoke there on the skyline. And of course, as we see these strikes continuing, the thoughts about the 200 plus, 220 maybe, hostages still being held in Gaza, in particular with the comments from Qatar this morning, with the Prime Minister Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdulrahman basically saying there are hopes there will be a breakthrough on the hostage release soon. There is some progress and some breakthrough on the hostage negotiations, but clearly the numbers involved and when that might happen still very much in question.
Gershon Baskin has been involved in hostage negotiations between Israel and Hamas before. He helped secure the release of Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit from Hamas captivity in 2011. That was in exchange for the release of 1,027 Palestinian prisoners. And Gershon can join us now. Really good of you to spare the time for us this afternoon on GB News. Thank you so much. Can you explain to us how devastatingly complicated it is to get these 220 hostages out?
It's extraordinarily difficult because there are no direct contacts between Israel and Hamas, which is the way that it should be done. But of course, that's not done. The Israelis won't talk to Hamas. Hamas won't talk to Israelis. So we need the help of third parties. There are two third parties who are engaged in negotiations. Each one of them has succeeded in freeing two hostages so far, Qatar and Egypt. It's not clear that either Qatar or Egypt has a full communication with all the parties that are involved in holding the hostages. Hamas has a leadership in Doha, in Qatar. They also have a political leadership in Gaza, and there's also the Al-Qassam, which is the military wing of Hamas, who are probably holding most of the hostages. But hostages are also being held apparently by Islamic Jihad, by the PFLP, and by other groups in Gaza. The question is this: Hamas political wing control the hostages, or the military wing, or someone else? The Egyptians are right next to Gaza. Their release that they secured the other night of two elderly women was done with the Al-Qassam, with the military wing of Hamas. Both sides are involved in the negotiations. The Hamas have declared that what they want is a cessation of Israeli bombing on Gaza, but they've also asked for other things, and they're only willing to release what they call the civilian hostages. We don't know what they mean by civilian hostages. They're holding women, children, elderly people, men of different ages, so we don't really know who they're talking about when they say civilian hostages.
So given all this complication, Gershon, and as you've indicated, perhaps a civilian wing, a military wing with different lines of command and a superstructure that's very complicated, what do you make of what Qatar has said this morning and the Prime Minister? The only way to find a peaceful solution is to keep communication channels open. Hopes there will be a breakthrough on the hostage release soon. Do we take them at their word?
Well, I think that they are trying. I know for a fact that for most of the last 2 weeks, they didn't have direct contact with the Israelis. The Qataris were communicating through the Americans to the Israelis, and that's a bit cumbersome. I understand that in the last day or two, they have had direct communication with the Israelis at a high enough level to make a difference. The Israeli National Security Advisor responded to the message from the Qatari Prime Minister in his own Twitter account, in which he thanked him, which is an indication that at least the National Security Advisor is involved in the talks with the Qataris. This is a very good thing. If the Qataris and the Israelis are talking directly, it will help to streamline the communications. I think that we have reason to hope, but we should be cautious also, because we've been in this situation before. We've never been in a situation where 200 20 hostages have been taken by one of Israel's enemies. I think it's unprecedented, the nature of the hostages who have been taken around the world. So we need to be cautious, and we don't want to build up expectations, particularly amongst the loved ones, the family members of the hostages. But all avenues need to be exhausted to retrieve hostages before there's an Israeli military incursion on the ground into Gaza, because that once that happens, the window of opportunity for negotiations is probably going to close.
In terms of the sheer number of hostages, that is a lot, isn't it, for captors to look after? So does that mean they might actually be more tempted to release them? Because looking after that many is so... It's a lot.
Right. It has to be a logistical nightmare for them. They're being probably kept underground in what's been called a web of tunnels that go for probably hundreds of kilometers underneath the entire Gaza Strip. Just having the food, the water, the sanitation, the special needs of people who need medicine. There are people with diabetes, there are people with other illnesses who need to be cared. How much do Hamas care about keeping so many people alive? When they held one Israeli hostage, an Israeli soldier, he was a very valuable asset, and they took very good care of him, making sure that he would be alive because he was worth so much more to them alive than dead. And they did get 1,027 Palestinian prisoners in exchange for him. But with 220 hostages, it's a different calculation.
And that begs the question, of course, given that members of this Al-Qassam brigades indicated that they were told specifically to go and capture people and take them back as hostages when they came over and hit the kibbutzes. What is the end game that they are trying to achieve here? Because one assumes they will have worked out, the likely Israeli response and what they want as a price to pay, if I can use that phrase.
Right. Well, I think that they took many more hostages and hostages of different nature than they originally planned. And that was because of the ease at which they broke through the Israeli border and defenses. I think there was a surprise. And I think that some of the hostage taking was not done by Hamas itself, but by other groups as well. It is against Islam to kill women and children and elderly people. It's against Islam. It's against the Quran to hold women, children, and elderly people as hostages. So they have gone against their own fundamental beliefs, and this should be noted. What do they want in exchange? Well, they've said they want to free all the prisoners, Palestinian prisons, from Israeli prisons. They thought when they broke through Israeli defenses that they were on the road to what they called liberating Palestine. That was said to me directly by several Hamas people in Gaza in the days after the October 7th Saturday attack. They thought that Israel was falling apart, Israel was going to collapse, and they would free Palestine and take over the whole territory. That is obviously not happening, and what they're suffering is enormous losses in Gaza. A humanitarian disaster is being done by Israel dropping bombs indiscriminately on the Gaza Strip, with more than 1.1 million people have lost their homes, and around 6,000 people have already been killed, many of them non-combatants, women and children as well. So this is a horrible disaster that's going on now, and Hamas has overstepped the lines that could be acceptable and has warranted themselves no longer worthy of governing.
Do you think that creates a difficulty in that there may be some arguments going on between the political and the military wings of Hamas that could complicate this further then?
I think for sure that there have to be arguments within Hamas. They show a united front. This could not have been done without agreement of the higher political echelon of the political side of Hamas. It's unthinkable that the military wing could have done such an attack without the agreement and knowledge of the political wing. So they are all collaborative in this, and it's quite difficult to know who in the end of the day is going to make decisions here. I cannot foresee a scenario where at the end of this war, Hamas is in control of Gaza and continues to pose a threat to Israel. I can also not imagine a scenario where there are people holding hostages or alive at the end of this. Many hostages may be sacrificed in the Israeli military plans if they're incapable of negotiating their release. Through the Qataris or through the Egyptians. The Israelis will eventually go into Gaza with their ground forces, and they are prepared for a very difficult battle. But they are prepared, and they're a lot stronger than Hamas.
There is a psychological game, though, isn't there, going on with Hamas? The way they put out that video of Yovshed and Nurit being freed yesterday, and it looked, to all intents and purposes, Yovshed shaking hands with her captor, almost a certain friendliness there. That's what they want people to think, isn't it?
Right, for sure, and we really don't know the circumstances of it. What I can tell you is that Miss Lipschitz is a woman living on the border of Gaza her whole life. She was one of the founders of the kibbutz on the border. She has been a volunteer in an organization which drives Palestinian children to hospitals in Israel. She's been doing that for years. We know that she has always believed that there could be peace between Israel and Palestine, and she has worked for that most of her life. I'm sure that she speaks some Arabic, and she probably know for her own safety that it's better to be on friendly terms with these people than be arrogant with them. And let's remember that her husband is still being held hostage.
And of course, he has been a man of peace as well, and has helped people coming across the border. This might be a tricky one for you, Gershon, but when you worked to release Gilad Shalit back in 2011, it was perhaps a more stable political situation in Israel. There is much discussion about perhaps the differences between the Israeli military and the Israeli government on what happens next. How much of that is a difficulty in terms of securing the release of the hostages?
I don't think that there is an argument between the military and the government. The military takes orders from the government. Netanyahu was forced to bring in more responsible people in the government from the opposition.
This war cabinet,
Right, because people don't trust Netanyahu anymore. In fact, there's a lot of calls for Netanyahu to resign now, and people say in wartime, and people say, yes, remember what happened to Mr. Chamberlain during World War II when Churchill replaced him. So there are precedents for this. Netanyahu does not have the trust of the people, but the army takes orders from the government, and the army will do whatever the government says, and it won't argue with the government. It will present alternatives. It will present scenarios. It will do its job in what it's supposed to do. But at the end of the day, the government will decide, and the army will take the orders.
Gershon, apologies if this is difficult for you to answer, but I just wondered whether it is more likely that we might see this drip feed of hostages, as we've been seeing over the last few days, rather than a big release of them. I know there was talk of some 50 being released altogether. What do you think is the more likely scenario here?
Yeah, I didn't believe that the talk of the 50 release was accurate. There were too many things that were inconsistent with the way that I know that Hamas responds. One is Hamas does not differentiate between Israelis with second passports and Israelis without them. And in fact, the first two women had two passports, and the second two women only had Israeli passports. I think actually that the first two releases we saw was less to do with the Hamas and more of a competition between Qatar and Egypt of who's in charge and who can deliver. Much less to do with the Hamas strategy. I'm not sure there's a coherent Hamas strategy right now on how to release the hostages. I think that they are serious when they said that they would release all the civilian hostages according to their definition. I would be much more pleased if they accepted what I was calling for from the very first days of releasing all the women, the children, the elderly, and the sick. That's much more clear to determine who they are and leaves much less discretion to Hamas. But Hamas is talking about civilians. So I think we should get out whoever we can get out before there is a military incursion. We should have a ceasefire for as long as possible to relieve the crisis that exists in Gaza and all the horrible things that are happening and the innocent people who are homeless and have no food and water, etc. That needs to happen. I can't see a scenario where the ground invasion is going to be canceled by Israel, regardless if there are hostages there or not.
Gershon, thank you very much for your time there in Jerusalem, and we wish you well. Thanks for your time here on GB News. Thank you.
So fiendishly difficult, but his analysis is second to none.
Now, there's been an angry reaction after it's been revealed barriers have been placed around the Cenotaph, the UK's foremost war memorial, of course, with concerns it could be damaged in any protests ahead of Remembrance Sunday.
Our London reporter Lisa Hartle is by the monument now. Good afternoon, Lisa. Are those barriers then likely to stay up until Remembrance Sunday?
Well, some of the police I've spoken to on the streets here since I got here have said no, they will be, well, we don't know when they're going to be taken down, but they just said that they'll be down before Remembrance Sunday, and they're in place until, well, at least after the weekend, because there are more protests planned this weekend, some in relation to the conflict between Israel and Hamas, but also another protest by the likes of Just Stop Oil. So they said that this is something that they do whenever there's a large-scale event, a protest to protect the Cenotaph, as obviously it's such a sacred place for so many people. At the weekend, we saw just the outrage from people when there was a stage during a protest placed next to the Cenotaph. After that happened and there was the outrage, Johnny Mercer, the Veterans Minister, who's also a veteran himself, came out and said that he understood why so many people were hurt by this, and he'd spoken to the Home Secretary and the Met Police to ensure that doesn't happen again. Since then, police have said that this weekend's protest, there will be no stage near the Cenotaph. They'll make sure that that's placed far away from there. And of course, these preventative measures to protect the Cenotaph come just weeks away until, like you said, we have the Remembrance Sunday, where thousands of people will be coming here to pay their respects and remember those that they've loved that have fallen.
Lisa, at the Cenotaph, thanks very much indeed for updating us on that.
Want to show you some pictures before we go of humanitarian aid that is on its way to Gaza from the UK. An RAF plane has left for Egypt carrying 21 tons of aid, C-17 aircraft. It's got wound care packs on board, water filters, 1,350 of them, and over 2,500 solar lights.
Yeah, it's part of a £30 million increase in support for the area announced earlier by the government. But let's just reflect that we've got the United Nations saying that they've got enough fuel left just for today. They may have to end their aid operations in Gaza tonight, they say. Hospitals say they are running dangerously short of fuel for their generators. And Pope Francis has said that he's renewing his call for help to reach those who are in need.
And all of this happening as in the last few moments there was a huge plume of smoke over the Gaza skyline.
Indications that perhaps a fuel dump or more rockets or some kind of ammunition's been hit, bearing in mind the scale of that plume of smoke there in the Gaza skyline. But of course the thoughts too about the hostages, 222 as we were hearing, their plight foremost in the minds of many, with the efforts still continuing to secure their release. All the latest for you here on GB News. Stay with us.
In a world of dull and predictable radio and TV shows.
Oh, hi. On Mark Dolan tonight, we've got big guests. We drill into the big stories of the day. The show adds up to a brilliant listening and viewing experience. Mark Dolan Tonight is the most entertaining current affairs show ever, and that's a fact. Join me, Mark Dolan, Fridays and Saturdays from 9, Sundays from 10. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
There's only 3 people you can trust in life. Your doctor, your lawyer, and your nana.
I'm not sure.
So join me, Nana Aquare, at 3 p.m. every Saturday and Sunday, where we discuss the biggest topics of the weekend. Be ready for battle.
Can you be quiet? What is this?
It's my new teeth.
It's your new teeth.
I don't bite. Well, not without a good reason. Always honest, always fun. Every weekend at 3 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
The Tubes